Nick ran. It didn't matter what direction. He just took as many turns, as many alleys as he could. If there was anything in his reach, he threw it behind him. He knocked a large plastic garbage can into his trail as he passed it. He heard a curse from behind him, either from a homeless man or a hired thug out to kill him. Nick reached a gate fence, a faint silver veil looming ahead in the moonlight. He kicked it hard enough that the latch broke and the gate swung open. There was an auto repair shop behind it, old enough that the garage door was rusted and cracked. He ran to it and whipped around. There was no one behind him. No one he could see, at least. He squatted beside the grip on the garage door and jerked upward as hard as he could. The metal handle on his padlock tore off the door. He crammed a hand under the door and lifted it carefully. It made grumbling metal clicking noises that were deafening in the quiet. He only lifted it enough for him to slide under. Then he carefully lowered the door, shutting him off into complete darkness. Nick, his back flat on the concrete floor, finally took a second to catch his breath. His hand inched along the floor until it landed on a wrench. He grabbed it, pushed himself to his feet, and stood on the inner garage handle with one enormous boot, effectively locking himself inside. He brandished the wrench and waited. But no one came. After the passage of several minutes in the oily-smelling darkness, he finally lowered the wrench. He dropped to one knee, swallowed hard, and wiped his forehead with a shaking arm. He'd really done it this time. He'd never been this screwed, and considering his past, that was saying a lot. At least in Kuwait, it wasn't hard to find someone who spoke English, and American money was something everyone understood. Tokyo was nothing like that. The Japanese he'd learned in the past few months was barely enough to get around. People stared at him in the street, the ruder ones muttering "Dakai" under their breath. He had some money in his pocket, but it wouldn't get him far in a city that expensive. He gritted his teeth. Why the hell had he come here? Why hadn't he gone to Prague when Jacob had promised him a job there? What had possessed him to follow Ito to a place where he would always be dependent? He could still see Ito smiling at him over the mess table.
Your thirst for knowledge is rare, Nick-san. It is a very beautiful thing. Do you want me to teach you? I know many things.
Nick grimaced. The Ito he'd known as a Legionnaire was gone, transformed into a rail-thin, bug-eyed addict on his own concoction. The glee on Ito's face as he filled his syringes would haunt Nick's dreams. It was sweltering in the garage. Nick ran an arm across the sweat on his face. Something bumped his nose and sent a sharp pain through his forearm. He flipped his forearm upward and squinted in the darkness. He'd fled during an injection. Was the needle still in him? As he barely made out the contraption in his skin, a memory struck him. He let Ito give him an angiocatheter, a small plastic device meant to ease multiple injections. It was still inside him, taped firmly against his arm in the bulging dark veins that coursed towards his elbow. And screwed into the end was a thin syringe, light enough that it hadn't torn itself from the catheter free during his escape. His heart pounding, Nick unscrewed the syringe and gently flicked it. His eyes caught the tiny bubbles that traveled up the tube. There was still a dose inside. One tiny, terrible dose.
Ayase sat with Sachi for hours. At first, she just listened while he told her everything about himself. He explained his power, and when he discovered as a child that he was different from other boys. Ayase could relate to that. She hadn't thought she was abnormal until the nuns lectured her for lying about herself. But Sachi's upbringing was different from hers. He was in one foster family for most of his life, and things there had been surprisingly normal. Even the rockier times with his new foster mother improved once he met Daniel. Sachi had, in short, led a pretty happy life. So she hesitated. When he smiled at her gently and asked about her life, she gave him the short version. She didn't want to detail the compounding paranoia that had led to her chasing down a priest with a can of mace. The sun outside the church window set. Twilight turned to darkness, and eventually the lights outside blinked out, one by one. The pain in her injured arm faded to a dull ache. Ayase didn't know what time it was, but it felt like they'd been talking for an eternity. She rerouted the conversation to other people. She asked about Daniel and Nick. Sachi didn't know much about Daniel besides him being an expert on the supernatural, and Sachi knew nothing of Nick other than what he had told them both. Ayase scrambled for another topic so she wouldn't have to talk about herself again. What about Kadoyuki? She tried at last. You said you think he has a power? Sachi visibly wilted. He leaned back in his chair and pondered for a moment.
What do you know about Kato?
He asked at last. Practically nothing. Her mind wandered back to that bathroom. That he's having some sort of trouble right now, I guess. Sachi sighed.
I met Kato in junior high. He was really quiet and missed a lot of school. I bumped into him once and I felt this huge wave of fear off him. It kind of freaked me out. So I asked people about him, and somebody said his parents were abusive. When I talked to a teacher about it, they said he was already seeing the school shrink and going through different kinds of therapy. His mom had mental problems, and she was going through therapy herself. They said there was no evidence she was hurting him, though.
Sachi frowned.
But there was something else about him. I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to make friends with him, and we hung out a little, but he's not very sociable. He's really defensive about a lot of things. And since I couldn't figure out what was so different about him, I kept trying to subtly touch him to get readings on him. He caught on pretty quickly and accused me of coming on to him. And at that point, well, I was starting to wonder if I was attracted to him.
Sachi rubbed the back of his neck.
I couldn't think of any reason why I felt the way I did when I touched him. I knew I liked girls, but this was totally different from...
Sachi trailed off. When he looked up from his feet, he smiled sheepishly.
But I figured it out after I met Daniel. I was feeling Kato's ability. When I touch people with powers, they feel different from normal people.
He patted Aise's hands clasped on her lap.
Like when I touch you. I can sense something different on you. Like I sensed on Kato.
Aise pursed her lips. But you can't tell what the ability is just through touching, right? Sachi nodded.
Knowing he had a power made me want to help him even more. I tried to get him to see Daniel-san. I didn't want to freak him out, so I didn't say it was about being supernatural or anything. I just told him Daniel-san was a good person to talk to. Kato said he was tired of talking to authority figures. I guess he meant all those therapists. He'd locked himself up pretty tight by the end of 9th grade.
Daniel said he comes to pray.
Yeah, Daniel-san thinks Kato might be Catholic.
Catholic? Why?
Apparently Kato prays in Latin.
Aise stopped at that. She flashed back to the nuns who raised her, whispering Japanese and alien tongues as they bowed their heads. She tried to imagine Kadayuki like one of them. She couldn't. She couldn't think of him as anything but a cowering classmate with fear in his eyes. She dropped her gaze to the floor. Fear was the first thing Sachi had sensed on Kadayuki, too, and that had been years ago. What on earth was his ability? What kind of ability could haunt someone that deeply? Her thoughts were cut off by her stomach growling. Sachi checked his watch and made a surprised grunt.
Yikes, it's past 3 a.m.
His eyes flicked up to her.
Are you okay? You must be tired.
Not really. She'd attacked Daniel and Nick early on Friday, then fainted and slept until Saturday morning.
Me neither, but you're obviously hungry.
Sachi got to his feet and stretched his arms over his head. He yawned as he made his way from the kitchen table to the cabinets.
I think I saw some chips in here. You want those?
Aise quickly stood and made her way to the refrigerator. I'll find something, she murmured, weirdly embarrassed. You don't have to serve me or anything.
I know you're not comfortable in this place yet. Let me do something for you, Aise.
Aise opened the fridge and frowned. You've already done plenty, she argued. Sachi glanced back from the cabinets, something unspoken in his gaze.
Then let me spoil you a little. It's obvious you're not used to it.
Aise felt the color drain from her face. She stuck her head in the fridge to avoid Sachi's gaze. I'm fine, she muttered, although her tone sounded strange in her ears. Sachi's mobile phone suddenly rang from his pocket. Aise grabbed an onigiri from a plate of them as Sachi wondered aloud who could be calling at that hour. She closed the fridge as he unflipped the phone.
Hello?
Sachi balanced the phone against his shoulder.
Who is this?
He asked as he retrieved the bag of chips. There was a pause. Aise watched as Sachi's eyes widened in surprise. He slowly rested the chips on the table.
Kiyoshi, is that you? What's wrong? I can't understand you. What happened to Mai?
Aise only got in a few bites of her onigiri before Sachi sent her a very decisive look. He gestured to the hallway and mouthed the words, "Get Daniel-san." Aise blinked. Sachi's expression turned very grave as he held the phone with both hands.
Kiyoshi, is there someone with you? Joe? Please put him on. I can't understand you while you're crying.
Crying? Something was very wrong. Aise crammed the rest of the onigiri in her mouth as she ran down the hallway. She wondered about waking Daniel up in the middle of the night, but one of the 2 doors at the end of the hall was closed to block a quiet conversation. Aise knocked and swallowed her rice.
Yes? Hello?
Daniel-san? Sachi needs you. It was Nick who yanked open the door. He looked even more irritated than he'd been during the day.
For what? Aren't you kids asleep yet?
Aise scowled. Daniel pushed his way out from behind Nick and smiled down at Aise.
Don't be rude. What's the matter, my dear?
She led them to the kitchen. Sachi had put his mobile on speakerphone and rested it on the table. He put a finger to his lips as they approached. A scratchy version of Joe's voice echoed from the phone.
I told him not to call you, Sachi, but I still haven't... I don't know who to ask either. Shit, I wish I had Miki's number. We can't... Kyoshi's got less than 2 hours before he has to go back with these people, and if we call the cops, they might kill Mai.
Ayase gave a start. Did she really hear that? Daniel opened his mouth, but Sachi held up a hand.
Joe, tell me what happened. Kiyoshi said he was kidnapped?
He was, an hour ago. Some people kidnapped Mai, sent Kiyoshi a phony letter from her, then grabbed him when he showed up. But they dumped him right back here and told him to get his shit in order. They'll free Mai if he goes back and works for them.
Works for them? What does that mean?
I don't know, Sachi. He won't stop crying. He said he doesn't remember most of it. He doesn't even remember getting grabbed.
Then how do you know what really happened? Ayase asked.
What the hell? Am I on speakerphone?
Sachi sent Daniel and Nick another warning glance.
Yes, but it's just Ayase.
That's why I didn't want to call you, Sachi. Are you trying to drag half our class into this shit? How could she possibly help us?
I'm already here, she answered shortly. How do you know all of this if Kiyoshi doesn't?
Because I was there. I saw him get dragged off and... How could you forget your own kidnapping, Kiyoshi? Did you hit your head or something?
Sachi leaned closer to the phone.
Why can't he remember? Who grabbed him?
6 people, 4 men and 2 women. They had a car ready when they took him, and he said some were waiting in a car outside.
Daniel whispered what sounded like a prayer. Even Nick looked surprised.
Do you have any idea who these people are? What did they look like?
I don't know. But one of them was a vampire.
A what?
A vampire! Okay? Fuck, the cops hung up on me when I tried to tell them. The lady who grabbed Kiyoshi was a goddamn vampire!
Ayase's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A sudden rush of the day's conversations overwhelmed her mind.
There are more of us out there.
Sachi had used the word supernatural when referring to Ayase and himself. Now Ayase realized in a weird epiphany that possibly every other creature of myth was real. A chill ran down her spine.
Wait a minute.
Nick suddenly broke the silence and pushed his way to the phone.
You said the vampire was a woman? What does she look like?
What? Who the hell is that? Sachi!
Relax, kid. I'm trying to help you. Describe her.
Shit. She was maybe in her 20s, hair to her shoulders, wearing a weird pendant and a trench coat.
Was this at night? Was she still wearing sunglasses?
Actually, yeah.
Nick slammed a fist on the table. He stared up at Daniel, who met his gaze and turned pale.
She's not a vampire. She's just one of those jackasses who wishes she was. But she's also a night operative of a very dangerous organization.
Nick rubbed his mouth for a second.
Who's your friend? Why would they want him to work for them?
Hell if I know. Kyoshi has no idea, and he's not exactly a guy who attracts attention.
Where are you?
At our dorm. We're actually in the room next to ours. I was afraid they bugged our place so I could see in the window, and I didn't want to use our phone.
Nick straightened at that.
Good. They might be using phone taps if they're disorganized. I need to come see you, but it might draw attention going into a high school. Can you set up some sort of distraction for me to slip in?
Who the hell are you?
I'll bring one of your friends to vouch for me. I'll bring...
His eyes fell on Sachi, then suddenly snapped to Ayase. Something dawned on him.
The girl, Ayase. Can she get in your dorm?
Ayase nodded as Joe muttered something.
A distraction? So you can get in here?
Yeah.
Maybe. Give me a minute, and I'll call you back.
Sachi picked up the phone.
Let us know. And hang in there, Joe.
Joe cursed again, then cut out. Sachi closed his phone as Nick stomped over to Daniel and grabbed him by the arm.
Give us a minute.
He warned as he half-dragged Daniel back to their room down the hall. He slammed the door behind them. Ayase swallowed. She glanced at Sachi, who squirmed on his side of the table. After a few seconds, they both bolted quietly after the 2 men. They carefully pressed their ears against the door.
Are you crazy?
Came Daniel's muffled cry.
What other choice does this kid have? You know what they'll do to him.
No, we can't send him back, period.
Maybe you missed the part where they have a hostage.
Daniel mumbled something inaudible. Ayase strained to hear.
Look, I'm just as shocked as you are that Core's recruiting through kidnappings, but there's got to be a good reason they're after this kid.
Did you ever think it would come to this? Not just forcing people to stay, but forcing people to join?
They've been trying to kill me for years, Daniel. I wouldn't put anything past them.
Ayase exchanged a surprised glance with Sachi. Kyoshi had been kidnapped by the same people who were after Nick? Ayase tried to remember what he'd said about them. They controlled the drug that left those track marks. Ayase heard the shuffle of feet.
Please, Nick. We agree that your plan requires a trained operative, preferably someone from Kitty. How on earth could you expect a teenage boy to succeed?
They won't expect a teenager, especially since they only gave him a few hours of freedom. But I can outfit him in 30 minutes, easy.
There was the scrape of something opening, like a closet door or a drawer.
An opportunity like this won't fall on our laps again. And you know as well as I do they might kill him anyway, Daniel. At least we can give him a chance to escape.
Something slammed shut.
Especially since we can send him in with a communicator.
No, a wire is too dangerous.
We don't need a wire. We have the girl.
What? Ayse's heart started to pound. She licked dry lips as footsteps thudded on the other side of the door. She didn't notice Sachi pull back and hiss at her. The door suddenly flew inward, which sent Ayse pitching toward the floor. Nick grabbed her before she hit the ground. He snorted as she scrambled to her feet.
Think you can hack it as a spy?
He asked dryly. She brushed down her skirt. We have a right to know what's going on, she countered.
That's not what I mean.
Nick slapped a black wig over his very short hair.
You're getting me in that dorm,
he said as he shrugged on a backpack.
We can't draw attention, but a group of 2 should be okay. Are you any good at acting?
I have no idea. She glanced at his wig and he angrily adjusted it.
Then just pretend to be a more normal teenage punk.
He grabbed her wrist.
Make it look like you're taking me to your room to screw me.
Joe slammed down the receiver. Kiyoshi, now sitting on the unfurnished bed, sniffed and rubbed a fist into his eye. At least he stopped wailing. Joe didn't say anything so he wouldn't worsen the situation, but Kiyoshi's waterworks were seriously undermining Joe's confidence. Joe was freaked out enough already, but seeing Kiyoshi bawl like a toddler was unnerving. He threw his roommate a look. Have you calmed down yet? Kiyoshi sniffed and ran a wrist under his nose.
Do they have a plan?
Maybe, but I need to find something out first. Joe looked around for his book bag. He'd accidentally thrown it under the bed when they'd come in. He got to his knees to drag it out. He dumped the books and sundries on the floor and started pawing through them. He wanted to stay the hell away from their dorm room. The kidnappers would be targeting it. Luckily, Joe knew the single room next to theirs had been abandoned a few days into the school year. The student in there had had a mental breakdown or something. That meant the place was empty, but the phone was still hooked up. It hadn't been a challenge to pick the lock, and Kiyoshi had been too distracted to ask Joe where he'd learned to do that. And now Joe didn't want to leave. He and Kiyoshi had only grabbed a few things before they'd switched rooms, and he couldn't remember where he left his math notebook. A few seconds of digging revealed it, thankfully, in the pile in front of him. He flipped through to find a page with a phone number scrawled in the margins. He checked his watch. 3:37 a.m. Is it too late? He wondered. Even on a Saturday night, most parties wound down after 2. He prayed to some unknown force as he grabbed the phone receiver and punched in his number. It rang. And rang. After an agonizing minute, the other end of the line finally clicked.
What's up? Who is this?
Joe straightened. Seiya? He asked. He strained his ears to hear for background noises. To his relief, he could make out laughter and a thumping bass line.
Yeah, who is this? Soshi?
It's Joe Oda. Are you at a party? Seiya's voice immediately lit up.
Joe, my man! What's up?
Are you at a party? Joe repeated firmly. Seiya sounded baked out of his mind, which was exactly what Joe wanted. Where are you?
Yeah, I'm at headquarters, actually. We're breaking in the first school weekend. Looking for some tail? A few girls showed up.
Seiya, I need a favor. Especially if you're with Byako. Joe peeked around the thin, cheap blinds blocking the window. Of the half-dozen cars scattered throughout the parking lot, the one with dark-tinted windows sat like a bomb in the quiet. Joe swallowed and pulled away from the window. Could you grab as many people as possible and... could you move that party to the freshman dorm parking lot?
The parking lot? Okay, but why?
Joe ground his teeth together. His mind worked in overdrive as he scrambled for an excuse. Seiya was at a Byako party, right? Not at some friend's house getting wasted. He was with the gang. This might be better than he'd planned. Seiryu attacked me. Last night, a few members jumped me. Mitsuko said she would tell Miki for me. Seiya seemed to sober up at that.
Seiryu? I heard about that. But you were the guy they jumped?
Joe swallowed. Not to sound like a sissy, but I'm just a little jumpy right now. Some guys looked at me sideways again today, and I'm wondering what I got myself into.
Hey! Don't say that! Byako protects its own, man! Especially if Seiryu's leftover bitches are giving you trouble!
Maybe I'm just being paranoid. But I thought a loud party that woke everyone up over the weekend might intimidate any undercover rivals, Joe said with a cringe, hoping that sounded okay. But it was more than enough for a stoned Seiya.
Great idea! We can show the freshman class the size of our army! I'll bring everybody! I'll even call guys who aren't here!
Can you get here by 4:15? That gives you half an hour.
Huh? I guess. Does it matter?
The sooner the better? Joe tried to think of a good closing. Thanks, Seiya. I feel a lot safer now.
You can count on me!
Byako forever.
Byako forever!
He started shouting things away from the phone. His end of the line clicked out. Joe didn't waste time. He immediately called Sachi to tell him about Byakko and the timing of their arrival. Sachi double-checked Joe's current room number and told him ISA would be there soon. Joe hung up, stared at the phone, then finally allowed himself a deep breath. Good, Joe, good. Joe had officially exhausted his options. Now it was up to ISA and that guy she and Sachi had been with. Joe had no idea what the two of them were up to. Hadn't Sachi said ISA wanted nothing to do with him right now? And now they were skipping school together to hang out with some random... Joe cut off his thoughts. I don't care, he darkly reminded himself. If they knew who was after Kiyoshi, that was the best lead any of them had. Joe fished through his pocket for his box of cigarettes. He slid a stick between his lips and lit up. He took a very, very long drag. Then he closed his eyes and slowly released it. As the smoke rolled off his tongue and through his nostrils, he felt the tantalizing tendril of calm snake through him. He took another drag. He noticed with satisfaction that his hands were no longer shaking.
Joe?
Joe turned. Kiyoshi, still sitting on the bed, hung his head over slouched shoulders. His tangled hair and dirty clothes made him look like a street drifter, squatting in an abandoned room while he had the chance. Joe pursed his lips over the cigarette. He pulled the chair from the empty desk, scraped it closer to Kiyoshi, and lowered himself onto the wood. What, Kiyoshi? Kiyoshi looked up. His bloodshot eyes peeked out from under the mess of hair.
Should I call my uncle? I mean, he'll worry if I don't come back. I don't...
Joe let out a breath. He leaned over to the pile of books on the floor and grabbed the toiletry bag he'd thrown in there. He'd also packed a few bottled drinks. One bottle of water had rolled near his feet. He unzipped the bag and pulled out his face towel. How often do you talk to him? Joe murmured around his cigarette. He dampened the towel and handed it to Kiyoshi. Clean yourself up. You'll feel better. Kiyoshi sadly accepted the towel.
He called every few weeks. He said he likes keeping in touch, but he wants me to have my space.
Kiyoshi swallowed and ran the towel down his neck.
And he's really busy after his work transfer. He probably wants his space too.
Joe puffed for a few seconds. Then no, he said at last. Don't worry about him yet. Kiyoshi ran the damp towel over his hair.
But...
You can't think like that, Kiyoshi. Joe took a drag, his fingers curled over his mouth. You can't. Kiyoshi swallowed. For the next several minutes, he slowly wiped the worst of the dirt off his clothes. He ran his fingers through his hair in a half-hearted attempt to brush it. Watching Kiyoshi made Joe's stomach drop. He stood stiffly from his chair and instead paced the room. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the floor. Shit. Joe didn't know what to say. There was nothing he could say. They just needed to wait, but the silence in the room and the look on Kiyoshi's face made Joe feel sick. He burned through several cigarettes while pacing that room. When Kiyoshi started coughing, Joe mumbled an apology and put out his last stick. Kiyoshi rubbed his nose. A moment of silence passed.
Do you miss your mom?
Joe looked up at that. What? He asked in surprise. Kiyoshi stared at his feet.
I miss mine. She died a few years ago, but I still miss her. And when bad stuff happens, still think I'd be okay if I could just get to her.
Joe swallowed. His fingers twitched, eager for a cigarette.
I know it's stupid. She couldn't protect me from something like this. I mean, she died in a car accident. She was a totally normal person. But I can't help it, you know? Whenever I get in trouble, she always knew how to fix it. She'd call someone or show up at my school or just talk to me and make me see things differently. Even when I got older, I felt like she can make any problem disappear. And I still feel that way, even though she's dead.
Joe felt something heavy pressed down on his chest. He averted his eyes. What was she like?
I don't know. Like most moms. She was a good cook. She sang me to sleep when I was little. She loved the dramas they play on TV. She'd get all worked up over them, crying when people kissed and stuff. When I was in junior high, she made me watch them with her. She wanted to squeeze someone's hand during the dramatic parts.
Joe couldn't help but relax a little at that. He slowly returned to the chair by Kiyoshi's side. Do you believe in ghosts? Joe asked carefully. Kiyoshi frowned. He scratched his head.
Maybe.
Do you believe that ghosts watch over the living? Kiyoshi bit his lip. He ran a fist over his eyes. Joe slid an unlit cigarette between his lips. He felt the need to say something, but he didn't want to lie. He was never good in situations like this. If there was one thing Joe hadn't mastered, it was the art of touchy-feely. So he just sighed. It's okay, Kiyoshi. he murmured around the stick in his mouth. His fingers curled around the backing of his chair. You're not alone. A faint whooping from outside broke the silence. Joe jumped to his feet. In the seconds it took him to run to the window, the whooping multiplied tenfold. He peeked through the blinds with his heart in his throat. A horde of teenagers who looked smashed out of their minds descended on the parking lot. They were accompanied by a half-dozen cars stuffed to the gills with more people, honking obnoxiously as they rolled into the lot. Based on how loud they were, there'd been more booze than joints at that Biako party. As Joe watched the blacktop fill with screeching punks, a strange sense of accomplishment lifted his spirits. True to his word, Seiya had brought an army. Kiyoshi peeked around Joe's fingers.
Are those your friends? How did you get so many?
Long story. Joe watched as one of the older teenagers drunkenly climbed onto a car roof. He threw up his left fist, clenched around a white t-shirt.
Who owns this city? Biako!
The gang shouted in unison. Their leader swayed slightly as he yelled something else, but Joe couldn't make it out. The chanting went back and forth for a few minutes like some sort of drugged-up pep rally. Joe could hear doors opening in the hallway, half-awake students asking each other what all the noise was. Joe froze. It was hard to tell from the angle, but he thought he saw a familiar girl in a school uniform with a very large partner at the dorm door. She fumbled for her keys, but a sleepy student in his boxers opened the door for them as he stepped out. The large man swept the girl into his arms and bounded into the building. I think that's them. Joe pulled away from the blinds. He turned quickly to Kiyoshi. Are you ready? Kiyoshi swallowed and nodded. Joe ran to the door, unlocked it, and carefully poked his head out. At the end of the hall, the man burst from the door to the stairwell, and Joe confirmed that the uncomfortable girl in his arms was Ayase. Joe pulled back into the room and stood without thinking to block Kiyoshi. The door flew open. Joe's heart froze when he saw the man up close. What the fuck?
Wait, that's the guy who attacked us in blue light.
Joe bit down on his cigarette, spilling bitter tobacco on his tongue. That black wig didn't fool him for a second. Memories of that night flooded his brain and initiated his adrenaline.
I know.
Ayase said quickly. She struggled in the man's arms. He finally put her down as he kicked the door shut behind him. She held up her hands defensively.
But I think he can help us.
The man made a small whistle through his teeth.
Son of a bitch.
He muttered as he took in Joe and Kiyoshi.
All four of you from that night, huh? That can't be coincidence.
An uncharacteristic rage bubbled up in Joe. Then you dragged us into this? I thought your ass was in jail. The man pulled off his wig and stuffed it into his backpack.
There's no time to explain. All of you sit down. I didn't get you into this mess, but I'm gonna try to get you out of it.
Joe stared incredulously at Ayase. Do you honestly trust this guy? She sighed and sat on the bed.
For now, he seems to know what he's talking about.
Joe turned to Kiyoshi. Kiyoshi just stared back, his eyebrows creased nervously.
Sit down.
Joe flicked his cigarette away and spat flakes of tobacco. The Gaijin time bomb. The man twitched slightly at the words.
Don't call me that. My name is Nick. Sit down.
Kiyoshi slowly went to the bed and sat down beside Ayase. Joe remained standing and crossed his arms, defiant. Nick gave up on him and instead turned to Kiyoshi.
You're the one they kidnapped, right?
Kiyoshi nodded.
The people who took you are part of a drug organization. We're pretty sure they're working with certain factions of the Yakuza in Tokyo. They're trying to consolidate power. They've only existed for 5 years, but they're already packing a lot of money and firepower.
Consolidate power? Joe scowled. What does that even mean?
We're not sure. We don't know what their end goal is. Their leader is a power-hungry psycho with better connections than the average criminal. Yakuza is a good fit for them now, but in the future I wouldn't rule out corrupt politics.
Nick took a breath.
What I'm about to tell you kids cannot leave this room. I'm not kidding when I say it could get you killed.
Joe opened his mouth to object, but Nick interrupted.
It's too late to protect any of you. You're knee-deep in this shit. So the information could get you killed, or it could save your life.
Joe closed his mouth. His mind screamed 1,000 retorts, but something kept him silent. He swallowed his complaints and waited. Nick rolled up his sleeves.
The group is called Core,
he said, pronouncing the foreign word.
It's the English word for Kakushin, the integral center. They empower and enslave their members with a drug called pitch.
Pitch? Like in baseball?
No. In English, pitch is also the word for a sticky black substance you get from tar. They picked a name that would confuse people.
He turned his wrists toward the ceiling and held out his arms.
It's a reference to the color it turns your veins.
Joe's stomach turned as his eyes ran over Nick's arms. Joe had seen heroin track marks before, but nothing nearly as nasty as what lay before him. Even in the dark room, he could see how far the black rivers throbbed under Nick's skin. Nick looked up at the boy on the bed.
Kiyoshi, they're going to inject you with this.
Kiyoshi turned white as a ghost.
What?
They give it to all of their members. It's a performance-enhancing drug. Ayase told me you're an athlete. You've heard of anabolic steroids, right?
Kyoshi couldn't reply. He gripped his shaking elbows. Nick rolled his sleeves back down.
Pitch gets results like anabolic steroids, but it goes a lot deeper. It basically pushes your body into building up its foundations on a biomolecular level. We don't know much about how it works, but the results are obvious. Taking it makes you stronger, faster. Your senses get sharper and your brain works more quickly. It's the kind of superdrug a government would kill for, since it could make the perfect soldier, but since it works on such a fundamental level, it's more versatile than a weapon of war. It makes anyone better at anything. It makes anyone better at everything.
Joe glared skeptically at the man. He had to be exaggerating.
The organization and the existence of pitch is a violently guarded secret. I said governments would kill for this drug? CORE is way ahead of them on that. The head of CORE mixed the nastiest, most addictive substance you could possibly imagine into pitch. A single dose can cause the kind of physical dependence you see in the long-term barbiturate or benzodiazepine addicts. The withdrawal effects can kill you. And there's a fiercely protected system that doles out pitch. If a CORE member tries to go around it and CORE denies them a dose, the member will either die or come painfully close. And if anyone threatens the safety of the organization in a more obvious way, they're stone cold killed. CORE has more than enough money to hire all the muscle and guns they need.
Kyoshi hiccuped as tears spilled down his face. He lifted his knees to his chest and buried his head in his arms.
Why? Why do they want me?
I don't know. You're the first case I've heard of where they kidnap a recruit. There usually are plenty of power-hungry dirtbags who will go willingly. Are you connected to anyone powerful? Do you have family members in the Yakuza?
No, I mean, I barely even have a family. I didn't do anything.
Joe's stomach clenched. He turned away as ISA hesitantly tried to rub Kyoshi's back. No. Joe wiped the cold sweat beating on the back of his neck. No, he tried to reason with himself. This isn't happening. There was a part of him that wanted to protect himself with his distrust of Nick. It was his shield against the words that came out of the man's mouth. They couldn't trust the time bomb. He was lying to them. But that visceral distrust couldn't erase the image of those bruised, bloated veins, the black rivers that laced across Joe's vision when he closed his eyes. Kyoshi's whimpering filled the quiet room. Joe wanted to vomit.
Now comes the good news.
Nick said evenly as he unzipped his backpack.
It's possible to escape CORE. I'm living proof of that. And I've spent the last 4 years figuring out how to block pitch.
ISA looked up.
What do you mean?
Like I said, pitch is a mixture. It includes an additive that causes the addiction. I was able to isolate that additive from the pitch I escaped with and narrow it down to a class of better-known addictive drugs. And there's research on what receptors they act on.
Nick pulled out a small glass tube capped with a plastic top. He turned it upside down. Small dark shapes clinked inside. What are those? Nick smiled, which made him look almost sinister.
Receptor antagonists.
Joe couldn't take it anymore. He stomped over to the bed and glared at Nick. We just started high school, he snarled. We don't understand the science bullshit coming out of your mouth. What does this mean for Kyoshi? Kyoshi looked up from his knees, blinking.
I was getting to that. For the addiction to take hold in a user, it has to bind to the receptor sites in the body. If we block those receptors with a different drug, we block the addiction and you just piss the stuff out.
He held the bottle out to Kyoshi.
These pills are sublinguals. That means you can dissolve them under your tongue and they'll hit your bloodstream pretty quick. I brought a thin plastic film we can wrap around your teeth to pack a few of those in your mouth without CORE knowing. Like a spy movie, kid.
Kyoshi stared at the bottle in front of him. Hesitantly, he picked it up and squinted at it. Joe tightened his jaw. And that'll work? He snapped.
It should. He needs it in his bloodstream right when he takes pitch, so he'll need to fiddle a pill free from his tooth before they shoot him up. But he can use his tongue or just stick a finger in his mouth if he thinks the injection is coming. It's the least suspicious route I could think of.
So one of these will keep me from getting addicted to pitch?
Dose for dose, 1 pill for 1 injection. So you're limited in how many injections you can take before we can get you out of there.
He gestured to ISA.
Which is where she comes in.
ISA suddenly shrunk back. But before Nick could explain, Kyoshi lurched to his feet. He shook his head as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks.
I don't think I can do this. I always screw up sensitive stuff. My mom wouldn't even let me dry the dishes because I broke so many.
Nick grabbed Kyoshi by the shoulders.
First of all, you need to calm down. This won't be hard if you can keep from freaking out. Also, after the first dose, you're going to be a whole new monster. Remember what I said about pitch being a superdrug?
Kyoshi nodded shakily.
We're only blocking the addiction additive, Kyoshi. You're still getting the regular effects.
Nick smiled thinly.
You're going to have the motor skills of a god.
Nick released him.
ISA, show him the bugs.
ISA said nothing. She just sat, trembling slightly, and stared hard at Nick. After a few seconds, Nick stepped over to her. He gripped her arm and dragged her to her feet.
There's no time for you to hesitate. We talked about this. We're all too deep into each other's shit now.
Joe furrowed his brow. The sick look on Ayase's face faded into her usual defensive frown. She reached out and touched Kyoshi's arm. She glanced briefly at Joe.
Don't freak out,
she breathed as she looked back up at Kyoshi. And then, her fingers dissolved into insects. Joe froze. Of all the things he'd seen that day, from the vampire to the track marks, this was by far the most insane. Kyoshi stared at the bugs, his eyes wide and his mouth open in a silent cry. When the insects started crawling up his skin, he yelped and jerked his arm. The bugs zipped back to Ayase and reformed her fingers. She flexed them. Shit. Joe covered his mouth. Was he hallucinating all this? Was he dreaming? His clusterfuck of a day would be fixed if he was just dreaming. A hint of giddy hope bubbled up in his heart. None of this was happening. The kidnapping was improbable, but this was impossible. It proved he was in a dream. He pinched himself. Several times. Nick seemed to notice. He snorted at Joe.
You're awake. She turns into bugs.
Shut up, Joe hissed as he continued to pinch.
It's 4:45. When do you have to get back to them, Kyoshi?
Panic wiped the surprise right off Kyoshi's face. He snapped his head up at Nick.
They said to be back by 5 a.m. Do I really have to go back to them?
Nick pulled a few baggies of what looked like medical supplies from his backpack.
You'll be okay. Ayase can see through the eyes of those things. We'll send a few insects with you to make sure you're okay, and they'll give us information on where they're holding you and what kind of security they have. That way we can get you out of there.
He pulled on a pair of latex gloves.
Open your mouth. And Ayase, figure out a system of getting information to him. One sting means he's walking into danger or something.
Kyoshi hesitantly opened his mouth, and Nick pried his head back like a dentist. As he poked at Kyoshi's teeth and Ayase outlined a quick plan, Joe took the opportunity to grab a cigarette, light it, and puff for dear life. This wasn't happening. It wasn't. Joe stared at the end of his cigarette and thought of other things. It's Sunday, isn't it? He tried to focus on that. He had a few errands to run, and he wanted to start collecting phone numbers. He really needed Miki's. And Mitsuko's while he was at it. Mitsuko. Joe closed his eyes and pictured her from Friday night, her long legs disappearing into that short skirt. He tried to imagine her wearing the earrings he'd planted. She'd told him he had good taste. Those small gold dangles with stones to catch the light. Joe slowly realized he was being called. Dazed by his own fantasy, he glanced over his shoulder, to see Kyoshi staring at him with glassy eyes. Joe crashed, hard, right back into reality. He shakily put out his cigarette and walked over. Ayase stepped back to give him space. Nick was already peeking through the blinds.
I wanted to say goodbye. And thank you for today. If you hadn't seen the lady grab me, if you hadn't talked this out with Sachi... crap, I can't.
Joe averted his eyes. Carefully, he patted Kyoshi on the shoulder. Don't mention it, he said quietly. When Joe pulled his hand back, Kyoshi grabbed it. He cupped Joe's hand with both of his and squeezed. Some feeling, some long-buried, long-forgotten feeling leaked out of Joe's heart. He was suddenly a young boy, leaning into the arms of his second-to-last foster mother. Joe swallowed down the heat in his chest.
Please make sure Mai gets home okay. I got her in this mess, and I can't protect her. Please make sure they let her go.
Joe took a breath. You are protecting her, he murmured. You're trading yourself for her. He tried to smile, and it came out very slight. That's the most romantic fucking thing I've ever heard. Kyoshi hiccuped as tears rolled.
Don't get into the car until you get proof they're letting her go. With a crowd like that outside, they'll be nervous about you making a scene. They don't have anything until you go with them. Demand proof, like a phone call from her.
Kyoshi slowly released Joe. He snuffled hard and grabbed the meager bag he'd packed earlier. Joe could see several insects snuggling more deeply into Kyoshi's shirt and hair. He glanced back one last time as he opened the door.
Bye.
And then he was gone, running down the hallway and out of their lives. Joe forced himself to breathe. He lowered himself into a chair as Nick and Ayase watched through the blinds. Joe lit up another cigarette as the dull roar of Byaku's lot party continued to bleed into the room. When Joe closed his lighter, he noticed unsurprisingly that his hands were shaking again. He didn't even have the strength to curse at himself. He still felt Kyoshi's shaking, sweaty touch.
She's okay.
Joe looked up. Ayase's eyes were squeezed closed in a look of concentration.
They're showing him a live video of Mai. She's asleep on a communal couch. It's in one of the other dorms, actually.
She furrowed her brow.
They're leaving her there.
Welcome relief undid some of the coils from Joe's stomach. As Ayase murmured details of the car Kyoshi entered, Joe sighed and took another long drag.
I don't mean to get into your business or anything, Joe, but if you needed help, you would ask for it, right?
Ah, you're a good guy. You're a really good guy.
Do you miss your mom?
The corners of Joe's eyes burned. He coughed and dragged again.
It was 5 in the morning. Granted, Ayase had slept for 20-odd hours the night before, and adrenaline was keeping her brain running overtime, but it was still 5 in the morning. This mission was far outside her comfort zone. Her secret was spreading, and she was being forced to use it by people she barely knew, which filled her body with a sick wave of panic that threatened to send her into a meltdown. But besides all that, from a logistical standpoint, she was seriously struggling. Ayase had never tried to send bugs to be her eyes elsewhere. She hadn't even thought of that until Nick had trapped one of her bugs in a jar. And now here she was sending several of them with a classmate whose life depended on her being able to spy through her bugs both well and subtly. If she screwed up, Kiyoshi would be left to the mercy of Core, or if she screwed up badly enough, he would be at their mercy when they knew he'd tried to spy on them. Ayase concentrated harder than she ever had in her life. The first job was simple. Of the 3 bugs she'd sent with Kiyoshi, one of them flew off him before he entered the car. She sent the bug to investigate the vehicle, passing Nick whatever details she could make out through her fuzzy compound eyes. She got most of the license plate information and the make of the car itself. Then she planted that bug at the base of the car antenna, positioning it so she could see the route as they drove it. Her view from that angle was limited, so she couldn't make out most street signs in the pre-dawn darkness, but it was a decent way to follow wherever Core took Kiyoshi. The other job was harder. Keeping 2 bugs hidden on Kiyoshi while listening to and watching what happened in the car while she paid attention to the directions with the bug outside, she could only split her attention so many ways. It took everything she had just to move the bugs separately. She'd always controlled her bugs as units or groups of units, not as tiny individuals with complicated tasks. "They're blindfolding him," she said quickly, the skin of her forehead pulled tight. "The car's taking a left. They're telling him to relax, that he's in good hands. He can have everything he's ever wanted as long as he cooperates with the group." She heard Nick grunt over the scratching of his pencil.
Right. Like this is a career.
They took another left. I don't know what street it is, but there's a Mr. Donut on the corner and a gas station across from it. There's a rail stop up ahead, stoplight. They're asking if he contacted his family. Kiyoshi said his uncle wasn't home when he called him. "Did you leave a message?" No, he didn't. One of the men looks angry, but the other one says it's okay. Green light, they're going straight. They're asking about his sister? Ayase frowned, trying to translate the words she'd picked up through her vibrating antennae. Kiyoshi says he didn't... I didn't catch that. They're saying it doesn't matter. They can tie up any loose ends he forgot. Taking a left at an office building, Kyoshi's asking about Mai. They're saying...
I need more on that office building.
Ayase squeezed her eyes shut tighter. It has a red sign across the street from another office building. They're turning right at a convenience store, going straight, passing a family restaurant on the left. Shoot, I missed. Something about Mai not remembering anything? She'll have a normal life? Gas station on the left, entering the highway. The pencil scratched across paper.
I need a tape recorder for you. If you can't focus on everything, just stick with the directions. We need a decent idea of where they're going.
Ayase swallowed. She adjusted all of her attention to the bug outside the car, though guilt weighed like a stone inside her stomach. They were still talking to Kiyoshi, and he was blurting scared answers in the back of her mind, but she had to ignore it. She focused on the highway signs. The car didn't arrive at its destination for a good 30 minutes. Ayase described the tall office building as they rumbled into the garage. It looked like a normal building, but little flashing lights implied that they were passing through security checkpoints. They drove into a small, isolated garage with locking doors within the greater garage. They pulled Kiyoshi out and searched him again. They'd searched him quickly in the car, but this was obviously more thorough. They patted him down, used a wand that detected metal, used some other device that they ran over his body. Ayase scooted her bugs into the folds of Kiyoshi's clothes so they wouldn't stand out during the pat-down.
"He's clean."
Satisfied, they returned the pocket change that had set off the metal detector. Someone took his arm and they led him, still blindfolded, through a door that they unlocked with a keycard. They took an elevator up 11 flights. They walked through a hallway past rooms that looked like offices and eventually unlocked a completely empty, windowless room. Ayase had one of her 2 remaining insects jump off him as they pushed Kiyoshi inside. She flew the outside bug into a corner of the hall ceiling. No one seemed to notice. The other insect stayed buried near Kiyoshi's neck. They finally removed the blindfold. Someone brought a plastic bag and emptied the contents on the floor of the room. 2 bottles of water, 2 convenience store sandwiches, and a plastic bucket.
Someone will check on you in a few hours, Honda.
One of the men said gruffly.
If you need to piss, use the bucket. Don't give us trouble and everything will be fine. You're on probation. If you pass, you'll get a proper room and you can start requesting things. But if you try anything funny...
One of the men snorted.
Like the bitch before you. We had to kick her ass. But be a good boy and we won't hurt you.
Nick asked Ayase to clarify when she relayed the last part.
There was a girl before him? Are they talking about Mai? Or did they kidnap someone else?
But the captors were done talking. They slammed the door shut behind Kiyoshi, locking him in darkness. Ayase saw from the bug outside that one man agreed to keep watch. He dragged a chair from an office to sit outside Kiyoshi's room. He pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket, lit up, and leaned back as he took a drag. Inside the room, Ayase's insect eyes adjusted to the dark. Kiyoshi sniffed as he carefully stuck a few fingers into his mouth. Ayase guessed he was checking the pills. Then he walked to the back wall, turned, and slid down to sit on the floor. He hugged his legs to his chest.
Ayase?
Ayase paused. He said my name, she told Nick. Nick hissed something under his breath.
Don't let him do that. They're probably monitoring him. We don't want them hearing anything about you or even thinking he has a wire.
Ayase nodded. She sent the one remaining insect to buzz under Kiyoshi's left ear, their agreed sign for bad idea. He shivered and gripped his earlobe when she brushed it. She silently apologized. Maybe it would draw less attention if she could avoid tickling him. Kiyoshi pursed his lips together and stared at his knees. After a few minutes of silence, he shifted his legs under him so he could lift himself onto his knees. He pressed his palms together in front of him and lowered his head.
Mom?
He whispered. Ayase waited, not sure what to make of that. Kiyoshi closed his eyes.
Mom, if you're really a ghost, and if you're really watching over me, please help me get through this. And please let Mai forget all of this, and live a normal life like they said, and thank you for looking after me.
He found a way to communicate with us. A lick of hope strengthened Ayase's resolve. Kiyoshi was pulling himself together. Ayase relayed the action, and she heard Nick grunt his approval.
Good. Then there is a brain under all that hair.
Ayase grimaced. Her dislike of Nick deepened. Kiyoshi lowered himself to the floor and curled into a sleeping position. He let out a long breath and closed his eyes. Ayase, after checking with Nick, flew out from Kiyoshi's clothes and rested innocently on the floor near him. She was just an insect. No one would suspect an insect.
Can you get a good view of the door where you are?
Ayase nodded, her eyes still shut. Not much is happening outside, she added. The guard got a magazine.
Then forget about the guard for now. Move the bug in the hallway. I want you to check out the interior of the building if you can. Tell me anything you see that might identify the place. And let me know about patrols and security.
Right. Ayase sent the hallway bug away from the guard, turning a corner into a more comfortably empty hall. Back in the garage, her third insect settled into its place on the car, ready to wait out the hours in shut-up darkness. She felt something touch her. Her attention shifted back to Kiyoshi. She could see through her blurry compound gaze that he was watching her through heavy-lidded eyes. His arm lay between them, and his fingers gently, carefully stroked her chitinous back. Something warm spread through her chest. She decided not to relay the moment to Nick.
Joe wanted to move fast. A few minutes after the car with Kiyoshi drove away, he muttered his intentions to Nick and slipped out of the room. Half the dorm was awake because of Byako's lot party, so he drew no attention as he joined the crowd outside. He took a breath. The other dorm, the dorm he wanted, was a few hundred meters away. It sat in its own adjacent lot, its parking area undisturbed. A few glowing windows lit up the quiet darkness. Next to the chaos of the freshman lot, it seemed like a black hole of sinister solitude. Joe swallowed. "Do it," his mind ordered. "Do it, Joe." He didn't want to go. Every survival instinct in his body screamed at him to flee. He knew Core could still have people lurking in the darkness. To his dismay, there was no student traffic between that dorm and his own. He'd be waltzing in there alone, a walking, vulnerable target. But he didn't have a choice. He closed his eyes.
You're a good guy. You're a really good guy.
Joe didn't agree, but maybe for a few minutes he could pretend it was true. He pushed his way through the Byakko crowd, ignoring the hoots and laughter. When he stepped onto the sidewalk that separated the two dorm lots, he forced down the panic that rose up in his heart. He walked to the other dorm as naturally as possible. His heartbeat thundered with every passing step. He reached the dorm entrance. He'd been planning to pick the lock, but a doorstop had been wedged between the doors to keep them from locking when they closed. The defensive part of Joe's mind argued that students did that all the time if they lost their keys or were meeting up. The rest of Joe's mind drowned out that part with deafening alarm bells. He reached a shaking hand toward the door, half expecting it to explode. He had to manually push every muscle in his body forward. He cleared the door, then the entryway. With his senses slowed by fear, he stepped into the student lounge like he was walking through a wall of water. She was there. The petite jock he'd seen on Friday, wearing the same clothes she'd had on then, was curled on a communal couch and sleeping deeply. Her clothes and hair were messy, but she seemed unhurt. Joe's eyes darted around. From what he could tell, the room was empty. He walked quickly to the couch and dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey." He shook her by the shoulder. "Are you okay? Can you wake up?" The girl stirred. She blearily opened her eyes and coughed in Joe's face. He smelled rotting breath, but no alcohol or smoke. She moaned and gripped her head.
What? Where am I? What happened?
"You're in the North Dorm. Are you hurt?" The girl moaned again and blinked her eyes. She settled a surprisingly lucid gaze on Joe. She frowned.
Who are you?
Joe shook his head. "It's not important. Can you tell me what happened?"
Jeez.
She awkwardly rubbed the back of her hand over her mouth.
I went to that party at Chitosi's place. I think I drank too much. I don't remember it that well. Then I went back with Haruna. I was really sick and slept most of the day, and then...
She checked her watch.
Is it still Saturday?
Joe dwelled on that a moment. This didn't sound right. Kyoshi had said he'd seen video of Mai tied up in a room somewhere. "You're Mai Endo, right?" She pushed herself to a sitting position and pulled back from him.
Yeah. Have we met?
Joe's mind raced. His eyes trailed over her, which made her close her knees defensively. He landed on her forearms. The room was dark, but he made out very slight red abrasions and small patches of missing hair around her wrists. It had happened. "I'm a friend of a friend," he said quickly. "Mitsuko-senpai said your roommate's worried about you, and it's technically Sunday." The distrust on Mai's face melted away.
Oh, right. I guess I didn't tell her I was gonna be out. But it's not like I planned it.
She grimaced.
Yikes, I guess I slept the entire day away.
"So you think you were with a friend? Haruka?"
Haruna.
Mai corrected as she slid her feet to the floor.
I think she helped me to her place when I got drunk, but I don't remember it well.
She averted her eyes sheepishly.
I guess I had too much.
"And she dropped you off here?"
I don't know. Probably? I think I just slept a lot.
Mai gripped her head, a vaguely sick feeling registering on her face.
And had nightmares.
Joe didn't know what else to say. He moved out of the way as Mai shakily stood. She fished through her pocket for her keys. "What floor are you on?"
"Third."
"I'll help you up the stairs." She frowned at him.
I'm okay.
"You just said you got fucked up this weekend. It's okay. I promised Mitsuko I'd get you home if I found you." Mai sighed. Joe accompanied Mai up the stairs. She was a little shaky, but seemed unhurt. When she got to her room and unlocked the door, Joe heard blurted surprise from the other side of the wood.
Hi.
Mai whispered as she slid into the room. A girl with tousled hair sat up in bed.
Mai? Where the heck were you yesterday?
Mai bowed her head politely at Joe and closed the door behind her. Joe stood in the hallway a moment. He had to force himself to unclench his jaw and shoulders. "The coast is clear." He repeated the line like a mantra over and over in his head. "It's okay. You're okay. She's okay." But it wasn't true, obviously. Things weren't okay. But they weren't worse. He just needed to try and work through his new information. Joe left the dorm and headed back toward his own. The empty space between the two lots didn't seem as intimidating when he was walking away from the quiet. Before he even stepped into the crowd, he spotted Seiya within it. His orange hair was like a beacon, leading the harmless, comforting noise. He grinned at Joe when he approached.
"Hey!"
he cried, slapping Joe on the shoulder.
"Pretty good crowd, huh? This what you wanted?"
Joe let out a breath. Yeah, he said quietly. Thank you, Saya. Saya paused, clearly surprised at the expression on Joe's face. Then he smiled again and lit up a cigarette.
Don't worry, Joe. Byakko looks after its own.
He turned and pointed to the teenager Joe had seen leading cheers from a car roof.
See? Even Ban came. That's how serious we take our reputation.
Ban. Joe searched his memory. Ban was the current leader of Byakko, wasn't he? The brother of the old leader, Takashi? Joe tried to memorize a few details. Ban was dressed in a traditionally punky style, with bleached hair and an earring. He was probably 18 or 19, although it was hard to tell in the limited light. Joe focused back on Saya. Can I borrow your mobile? He asked. Saya yawned and fished through his back pocket.
Sure,
he replied as he handed it over.
When you're done, I think I'm gonna bail. I'm pretty tired and we made our noise.
Joe removed Toya's business card from his chained wallet. He flipped it over. It had become his makeshift address book. He looked up to make sure Saya's attention was elsewhere before pushing open the phone and dialing one of the numbers he'd scratched down. It rang twice.
Yeah?
It's Joe.
Joe, make it quick. I'm writing down ISA's directions.
Joe lowered his voice. She's fine. I brought her to her room and it didn't look like anyone was watching us. She doesn't remember what happened.
What?
Nick barked. She thinks she passed out at a friend's house after getting drunk. She was vague about it, but she seemed convinced that's all that happened. But I saw marks on her. She was definitely tied up at some point. There was a moment of silence. Joe vaguely heard ISA's voice in the background.
Exit 22. I'm listening, ISA. Joe, was Mai lying to you?
No, I'm sure she wasn't. Joe glanced over at Saya again. Saya was muttering to himself and sorting through a handful of change. Joe kept his voice quiet. But this isn't just a gap in her memory, okay? She thinks something else happened. Like a
false memory. And Kiyoshi couldn't remember the key parts of his kidnapping, right? So we're looking at gaps and false memories. So Koa has at least one psychic on the payroll.
Joe stopped. Psychic?
Gotta go.
The phone call cut out abruptly. Joe closed the mobile phone and stared at it for a second. Despite Nick assuring him that the vampire he'd seen was just a goth with filed-down teeth, Joe had still seen ISA turn into bugs, and heard about a group of megalomaniacs who controlled a drug that made superhumans. Nick making a casual reference to psychics was just icing on the insanity cake. Joe let out a breath. He was suddenly very tired. The hour had caught up to him and his adrenaline was depleted. His usual practiced defense mechanisms kicked in to guide him home. He handed the phone back to Saya. Can I ask another favor? Joe asked tiredly. Saya blew smoke and dropped his cigarette to the blacktop.
What?
He asked as he ground out the stick with his heel. Can I crash at your place for a few days? You live with your parents, right? Saya winced.
Our place is really tiny and my mom's really nosy. She'll give you the 3rd degree at breakfast.
Breakfast. The word, accompanied with the mental image of some kind of family unit eating, was so comforting that Joe wanted to cry. He rubbed his sinuses and swallowed the lump in his throat. I'll be a perfect gentleman, and I'm happy to do the dishes. Saya gave a lopsided smile.
Kiss up.
A door slammed somewhere. Ayase jolted awake, her fragmented consciousness filling her with panic. The majority of her in human form jammed up to a sitting position against the headboard behind her. Where was she? What was she doing? After a few seconds, she recognized the bed she was in. It was the same one she'd woken up in last time. She was back in the church? She remembered Nick calling them a cab once things settled down with Kiyoshi. Had she fallen asleep in the taxi? Kiyoshi. Ayase squeezed shut her eyes and tried to regain her bearings. Kiyoshi was still locked in that room, asleep on the floor. His food and the bucket of water were untouched, making her think that no one had come to check on him yet. In the garage, nothing had changed either. But now there were new people in the hallway. She quickly flew her hall insect closer, trying to make out their conversation.
Has he been giving you any trouble?
Nah, he's scared out of his mind.
Good.
One of the new visitors, a woman, let out a breath.
We're still having issues with the other girl. Beating and sedating her for those first few injections was a bad idea. Her heart rate went all over the place after the pitch hit her bloodstream. We're monitoring her now to see if we did any permanent damage. She was showing signs of cardiac instability this morning, but she might have been faking it.
Why don't we just dump her? She seems like way more trouble than she's worth.
Junior insists that we keep her. And it's true that we could use a better information specialist.
She slid her hands into the pockets of her lab coat.
But no problems with this Honda kid yet?
Nope, not even a struggle.
The woman frowned.
What?
The man crossed his arms.
Is that suspicious?
Ayase's heart started to pound. She opened one human eye. She was still alone in the room with no one to relay information to. She wanted to scream. The woman said something. Ayase shut her eye.
So we'll move him to the room, let him sleep in a real bed.
The woman waved her hand.
If he's cooperative, reward him for it. We want him to stay cooperative. We should be done monitoring the girl in a few hours. We'll give him his first dose then.
The men nodded. Inside the room, Ayase quickly flew her bug back under Kiyoshi's collar. A few seconds later, the men unlocked the room and stomped inside.
Rise and shine, Honda.
Kiyoshi jerked awake. One of the men dragged him to his feet. He stumbled to stay standing.
Uh-huh.
Relax, you're getting a bed.
The man assured him. One of the other men collected Kiyoshi's uneaten food as Kiyoshi was marched down the hallway. Ayase's hallway bug flew into the elevator right behind them. One of the men seemed to notice her. He looked directly at her. Ayase's heart seized in her chest. Then he looked back down. He muttered something about
idiots leaving the window open and letting in bugs.
Ayase swallowed hard. You're just an insect, she reminded herself. No one suspects you. She noticed Kiyoshi squirm nervously and glance at the man, but the man's attention had returned to the task at hand. He shoved Kiyoshi out onto a new floor. Ayase barely noticed the floor number before zipping out of the elevator just in time. Ayase tried to calm herself as she followed the men down a hallway with lush carpeting and dim lights. They opened up a door at the end and shoved Kiyoshi inside.
Get some sleep while you can, and eat the food. We want you in good shape for this afternoon. There's a bathroom attached to the room if you need it.
They slammed the door and locked it. The men discussed who would take the first watch as Ayase hid her bug in a ceiling lamp. She awkwardly switched back to the bug in the room with Kiyoshi. She crawled up his neck and he yelped. Ayase gritted her teeth. Focus, she ordered herself. She flew off Kiyoshi and landed on the bed where he could see her. He looked around. The room they were in was a sparsely furnished apartment, windowless but otherwise reasonably inviting. It had a tiny bathless bathroom with its own door left ajar. One of the men had thrown the convenience store food on the neatly made bed. Kiyoshi frowned and picked up a sandwich.
Well, I kinda wanna sleep,
he mumbled both to himself and to Ayase.
But I am hungry.
She flew up and buzzed under his right ear. Knowing that she was trying to communicate the message good idea, Kiyoshi visibly relaxed. He sat down on the bed and unwrapped the sandwich. Ayase allowed herself a few moments of rest. She opened her human eyes and saw that still no one was with her. Frustration bubbled up in her until she noticed a thin black box resting on a table beside the bed. There was a note under it. She slid it free. Ayase-kun, the note read, Please record whatever you see. Nick and Sachi are sleeping but will help you when you need them. I'm in the church and will check in with you soon. Ayase picked up the small black box. It was a tape recorder, she realized. She pushed the button down and quickly recounted the developments with Kiyoshi. When she was done, she shifted back to the bugs. Kiyoshi was lying on the bed now, fading back into sleep. She took a position beside his pillow. One of the men was standing guard outside, but there was nothing more for her to explore out there. The hallway had no turns and every door was closed. She noted the number of Kiyoshi's room and then stayed tucked in the ceiling lamp. She returned to her human consciousness and let out a long breath. She sat there a moment, her mind spinning, and tried to swallow down the panic that filled her throat. She opened her eyes. There were voices outside, on the other side of her door. She looked up. She couldn't make out the words. She swung her legs over her bed and got to her feet. It sounded like Daniel. His voice had a tendency to crack into high notes, she'd noticed. She shuffled to the door and opened it a few centimeters. Daniel was indeed standing in the hallway outside. He spoke quietly to a pair of newcomers. The new person to Daniel's left made Ayase's stomach unconsciously clench. It was the dark-skinned man with green eyes, the one she'd seen from her time in the glass jar. Now that she could take him in with human eyes, she noticed new details. His heavy features, his thick eyebrows, a silver chain disappearing under the collar of his buttoned shirt. He was short compared to Daniel and was noticeably stocky. She couldn't guess his age. Older than she was, but younger than Daniel. Beside him stood a Japanese woman who also looked familiar. Was she one of the two Ayase had seen from the jar? She seemed a little older than the dark-skinned man, and the expression on her face was simultaneously serious and flustered. She had oddly pretty features despite the frazzled nature of her hair. An unseasonably thick coat and scarf were draped over her arm.
We're monitoring him now.
Daniel finished, letting out a breath.
There's not much else we can do, I'm afraid.
The woman frowned nervously.
What was his name again? I think I heard you wrong.
Kiyoshi Honda, I think it was. Unless... wait.
Daniel paused.
Am I getting that mixed up now that I'm seeing you? I'm sorry, I haven't slept much.
Daniel fished through a bag hanging off his arm and eventually pulled free with a Fukuhashi passbook. He handed it to the woman. She flipped the book open to the enclosed ID. She went very pale.
Kiyoshi Honda. No, you were right.
Daniel blinked at her.
Emmy, are you alright?
He asked as he quickly touched her arm. She said nothing. She just stared at the passbook, her lips tight and quivering. Green eyes suddenly flicked toward Ayase. She shrunk behind the door as the dark-skinned man turned to her.
Miss, you're awake now?
Daniel whipped his head around immediately. It took a few more seconds for the woman to tear her eyes from the passbook. Daniel ran over to Ayase, opening the door as she released it.
Ayase-kun! Are you alright? Have you seen anything new?
Ayase swallowed. She stared at the newcomers, still too paranoid to open up to strangers immediately. Who are they? She murmured. Daniel opened the door wider, giving Ayase nothing to hide behind.
They're with the church. They're here to help us. You can trust them.
Ayase furrowed her eyebrows. Your friends?
Yes, I wanted them here earlier, but Emmy was on assignment in Hokkaido. Zai just picked her up from the airport.
Daniel took Ayase's arm and gently led her out of the room.
Are you okay? Has anything changed with Kiyoshi?
Ayase licked dry lips. They moved him to a room with a bed, she said. He shouldn't get the injection for a few more hours. He's sleeping now. She gestured behind her. I recorded everything I heard on the tape recorder. Relief loosened the creases in Daniel's face. He gave a small smile.
Excellent,
he said, clapping her on the shoulder.
Excellent work, Ayase-kun.
Ayase rolled her gaze back to the strangers. The woman bowed quickly. The dark-skinned man nodded his head once and held a hand over his chest in some foreign greeting. Emmy-san? Ayase recited. And she couldn't remember the other one.
Zaid. You must be Ayase-san, the woman with the power of insects.
Ayase hesitated. Noticing the look on her face, Daniel eagerly nudged Ayase towards Zayed.
Zayed is a lot like you. He has a supernatural ability that falls outside the realm of psychics. Until we met you, he had the most baffling power I've ever seen.
Ayase waited. Zayed glanced at Daniel, then focused his green gaze on Ayase. His quiet eyes bore into her.
Are you anxious because of everything that's happening?
He asked in his slow Japanese. Ayase swallowed. Of course I am, she mumbled. She wanted to look away, but something compelled her to keep up with his gaze.
And the captive boy, he does not need monitoring for a few hours?
Ayase shook her head. Zayed stared. Ayase froze. And then she felt the nervous ropes in her chest loosen like invisible fingers pulled them apart. Her heartbeat slowed, her energy drained, and her legs turned to jelly. She felt drugged almost, sedated. She struggled to breathe as Zayed's eyelids drooped. Almost in sync, Emmy and Daniel crashed to the floor. Zayed turned quickly to Emmy. Daniel, giving a hoarse chuckle, struggled to his feet by Ayase's side.
Easy. We really haven't slept.
Daniel turned drooping eyes to Ayase.
Are you alright?
Ayase tried to think through the sudden fog in her mind. She wanted to defend against whatever had come over her, but she couldn't. She physically couldn't. It took all her effort just to keep her eyes open. She swayed on her feet. Daniel grabbed her as much to steady her as to steady himself. What's happening to me? Ayase breathed. Daniel gripped her shoulder.
It's okay. He's only trying to help you. You're okay.
Ayase opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes rolled back in her head. The world turned black as she fell into nothing.
Ayase, can you hear me?
Ayase's eyelids slowly lifted. A thin film covered her vision. There were two identical heads leaning over her. She blinked her eyes, trying to clear them. Huh? The two hazy faces leaning over her merged into one. Ayase took a deep breath and focused her eyes. It was Sachi. He looked a little different. The spikes in his hair were flattened awkwardly, like he'd slept on them and not seen a mirror since. He squinted down at her and gently shook her shoulder.
Ayase, are you okay?
He shook her again.
Ayase.
Ayase tried to speak, but it came out as a croak. He released her suddenly, as if noticing her awake for the first time.
Oh, sorry.
Sachi slid an arm under her shoulders and helped her into a sitting position. Ayase covered her mouth, struggling to think. What happened? Did I faint? Sachi frowned.
I'm not sure exactly. Daniel-san said his friend was trying to help you get some sleep. It's been...
Ayase froze. She cut Sachi off with a hand and squeezed shut her eyes. Nothing had changed at the core building. Kiyoshi was sleeping soundly, and the guard outside his door was reading a newspaper. Ayase let out the breath she'd unwittingly held. She rubbed her eyes and tried to slow her pounding heart. How long was I out?
2 hours. They wanted me to wake you up to check on Kiyoshi. Is that what you were just doing?
Ayase shifted against the headboard. He's fine, still asleep. She rubbed a stiff shoulder. Had she slept on it wrong, or had she fallen on it earlier? The ghostly image of those green eyes resurfaced in her mind. Ayase tried to piece together her last thoughts before passing out. That man, Zayed, hadn't touched her, but he'd done something. Something. It was like he'd sucked the energy right out of her. And what else? Ayase gripped her forehead and tried to think. Daniel had fallen over, and so had that other woman.
Are you okay?
Ayase shook her head, willing Sachi to stay quiet. She felt strangely helpless knowing she'd fainted for no reason. She wanted to remember. She wanted to know if she'd tried to resist. She was doing everything she could to be in 4 places at once, but now she was being crowded by strangers who kept tripping up her plans. She was the only one who could watch Kiyoshi, and yet the man with the green eyes had pulled the rug out from under her. Ayase shuddered. She felt violated, like a doctor had drugged her without her knowledge. Sachi frowned.
I don't know what they did to you, but I think they were just trying to help.
They didn't help, and they'd better not try it again. Sachi slumped back in the chair at her bedside. He rubbed his eyes for a few seconds, blinking them rapidly.
I'm sorry, Ayase. I wish I was there with you, but we were sort of sleeping in shifts. Daniel-san's asleep now, and Nick's in charge.
He reached out to gently pat her hand. He missed the first time and just patted her blanket.
But I'm up now, okay? I'll help you record or whatever else you need, and I won't let them use any powers on you, okay?
Ayase sighed. She pulled her hands into her lap, a gentle deterrent to Sachi using his power. He seemed to take the hint. He cleared his throat and stood.
But if you want space, I can give you that too.
He rubbed his eyes again.
I'm kind of hungry. I can get us something to eat if you're interested.
Ayase paused. Was she imagining things, or was he avoiding her gaze? And he kept rubbing his eyes like there was something stuck in them. I guess, she said at last. Did something happen to you, Sachi? To her surprise, Sachi gave a nervous laugh. He rubbed one bloodshot eye with a fist.
No, I just haven't slept much, you know? But none of us have.
He blinked a few more times.
I'll get us something from the kitchen. Just call if something changes with Kiyoshi.
Sachi walked quickly to the door, opened it, and then tripped on his way out. She heard another nervous laugh as he regained his footing in the hallway.
Be right back,
he called, his voice fading as he left. Ayase furrowed her brow. Something was off about him. Considering how stable Sachi had been through the past few days, she found his change weirdly upsetting. Was he hiding something from her? Had something else happened while she'd been unconscious? The possibilities dizzied her. She tried to force down her discomfort as she pushed her legs over the bed. If something was really wrong, Sachi would tell her, right? She trusted him, didn't she? Or, at least she trusted him more than anyone else at this point, right? Ayase swallowed. Rather than honestly answering that question, she left the room. She wanted to get away from that bed. The church wasn't big, so there was only one real hall that branched off into 2. She heard some fumbling from the kitchen. If that was Sachi in there, he was dropping things, and saw one room at the end of the hall with its door ajar. She made out Nick's broad back and heard him speaking in a foreign language that sounded like English. He moved out of her vision. A moment later she heard more English, but in a much quieter voice. Zayed. Ayase's stomach dropped. She took the hallway that led away from all that. Her hall ended in a door that led to the body of the church. Ayase found herself wondering if anyone was out there. Had Daniel closed the church? Did churches ever close? It was almost lunchtime, so there was a chance there were visitors. She tentatively pushed the door. To her dismay, someone was out there. A lone figure not much taller than she was and dressed in a familiar school uniform, including the jacket despite the warm weather. He stood in front of the altar and stared up at the cross, his hands deep in his pockets and a sick look on his face. Ayase blinked. The boy twitched. His eyes flew to her. It was Kadayuki. Ayase stared at him for a minute, completely lost on what to say. Kadayuki opened his mouth, then quickly closed it. He averted his gaze and squirmed nervously.
Hello,
he finally said like it was a giant accomplishment. Ayase bit her lip. Hello, she replied, and it was almost as awkward. She cursed inwardly. What's he doing here, she wondered. This felt so loaded. Kadayuki had seen her turn into the swarm and was hiding an ability of his own. The few times they'd met, he'd appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Ayase constantly put aside her questions about him because she had no choice. Kadayuki was never around. Or if he was, he would suddenly leave, taking his mysteries with him into the night. It was surreal, really. Ayase stared at the boy before her. If she blinked, would he vanish again? He's seen me naked. The horrible reminder from her subconscious hit her like a battering ram. She didn't want to care considering everything else, but she still felt the color drain from her face. It also reminded her that Daniel and Nick had seen her naked. The thought of Nick especially made Ayase's skin crawl. Kadayuki coughed and cleared his throat. There was a rasp to it, like his voice was hoarse.
Is Sachi here, Watanabe-san?
Ayase snapped back to attention. She pushed down the humiliation she felt creeping up on her. Yeah, she answered quickly. Are you here to see him? Should I get him? Kadayuki's mouth sunk, his already pale complexion making him look like a dead fish. He dug into one pocket as he blinked heavily. Ayase walked closer. Seeing Kadayuki in a time of quiet, improper light brought out how disheveled he looked. His uniform was dirty, his straw-like hair uncombed. He was starting to resemble a genuine vagrant. Kadayuki finally pulled a long, maroon-colored object from his pocket. It looked like a hard leather case. He held it out to her, his eyes dropping to the floor. Ayase frowned. She accepted the case and creaked it open on its hinges. A pair of eyeglasses rested inside.
I got them from his roommate. Could you make sure he gets them?
Sachi? Kadayuki nodded. Ayase stared at the glasses. They're his? She asked, still confused. She'd never seen Sachi wear glasses before. An upbeat, tinkling song suddenly started in Kadayuki's pocket. It sounded electronic, like music from a video game. The blood drained from his face. A familiar look of terror swept over his features. Ayase watched in surprise as Kadayuki whipped away from her. Without a word, he dug into his pocket and half ran toward the exit. As he pushed through the door, he pulled out a mobile phone and flipped it open. The music stopped as he held the phone to his ear.
Yeah?
The door swung shut behind him. A ringtone. Ayase felt a little stupid for not realizing that. There was something familiar about that song, like she'd heard it on TV. Ayase swallowed. As usual, Kadayuki left her feeling more confused than when he'd walked in.
Ayase?
Ayase turned. Sachi had pushed open the door and poked his head around it. He squinted at her.
Were you talking to someone out here?
Ayase held up the glasses case. Kadayuki, she explained. He brought you these. Sachi blinked.
Kato? He was here?
He squinted at the glasses case.
Brought me what?
Ayase walked over to him. To spare them both some fumbling, she took the glasses out and handed them to Sachi directly. Relief flooded Sachi's face. He coughed out a nervous chuckle and slid the glasses on. When he looked down at her, a new clarity filled the gaze behind the glass. He smiled. The awkwardness of their last conversation vanished along with the ghostly tension.
I don't know how Kato knew. Maybe it's his power. But honestly, I don't care. I'm just glad he did know.
You've never worn glasses before.
I usually wear contacts. But we've been holed up here and I had to take them out eventually. It's not like I can run out to a convenience store for contact solution right now.
He rubbed the back of his neck and smiled sheepishly.
And to be honest, I'm pretty blind without them.
Ayase furrowed her brow. Why didn't you say anything? Sachi shrugged and looked away.
I didn't want to complain when you have more important things to worry about.
But you made me worry. Sachi froze. He stared down at her, eyes wide. Ayase let out an angry breath. She looked away. You are acting weird. If you don't tell me it's something stupid, then I assume it's something horrible. She threw her hands up, frustrated. This is the craziest week of my life. You could be possessed by a monster for all I know. Sachi opened his mouth, then closed it again.
Sorry.
It's fine, just tell me if something's wrong, okay? You're pretty much the only person I trust right now. I don't think I could handle all this without you. Sachi was silent for a moment. Then, to Ayase's surprise, he turned red. Sachi looked away quickly, his feet shuffling on the floor.
Sorry. I'll be honest with you.
Ayase felt his weird discomfort bleed into her. She turned away, suddenly wishing she hadn't said anything. A door opened somewhere. It took Ayase a second to realize it was at the core building. She shut her eyes. There was a group of people walking down the hallway, the woman in the lab coat at their lead. She gave quick orders to the men around her. Ayase couldn't make out all the words, but she heard sick bay and injection. Ayase's stomach dropped. She reached out blindly with her human hand until it closed on Sachi's arm. "Get Nick," she said quickly. "I think they're coming for Kiyoshi." Ayase's insect sprang to life inside Kiyoshi's room. He was still asleep, so she flew over to buzz directly in his ear. He slapped at her instinctually. Slight pain blossomed in her wings, but he groggily woke up and turned his head.
Huh?
Ayase flew to the nape of Kiyoshi's neck. She buzzed up his hairline, batting her wings furiously against the skin and hair. Kiyoshi froze. He clearly recognized the signal. He mumbled something, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer, in a voice that cracked slightly. He pushed himself to a sitting position on the bed and pushed a finger in his mouth. He paused.
Mom, please watch over me.
Ayase buzzed under his right ear. Confirmation. Kiyoshi closed his eyes and fiddled with his tooth. The members of Corps burst through his door only moments later. 2 men dragged him off the bed as the woman in the lab coat told Kiyoshi to remain calm. Ayase's heart thundered as she dove under Kiyoshi's collar. She watched from other eyes in the hallway as Kiyoshi was marched back to the elevator.
Talk to us, Ayase.
Ayase opened a human eye. Nick was pulling her back to the kitchen. She was tripping, unable to focus enough on her limbs. He half carried her to a chair and held the tape recorder to her mouth. He leveled his hazel eyes on her, one big hand closing on her shoulder. She shut her eye. Zaid stood behind Nick, and she was pretty sure Sachi held her hand, but she blocked it all out. They're putting him on an elevator. He took the pill. Basement. He's a little unsteady on his feet. They're telling him to wake up.
He's probably getting high on the antagonist. But I warned him about that. They'll just think he's scared.
Isis squeezed her eyes shut tighter. She described the long, cold hallway and the medical area that looked like an operating room. They made Kiyoshi lie on a gurney and hooked him up to several monitors. When they strapped him down, he started to cry. The woman in the lab coat patted Kiyoshi on the head.
"Don't be scared,"
she said with odd gentleness.
"You're safer if we can keep you still."
Kiyoshi looked away and sobbed quietly. The woman squinted at the monitors.
Heart rate's a little low.
Is that a problem?
No, I just expected it to be up when he's this stressed.
She tied a piece of elastic around Kiyoshi's arm, just under the elbow. She pulled on a pair of latex gloves, slapped the skin of his forearm a few times, and rubbed the area with gauze.
"Can you make a fist for me, Honda?"
Kiyoshi just cried. The woman gently tilted Kiyoshi's face toward her. He tried to pull away.
I'm scared of needles.
The woman let out a breath.
"Then you don't have to look, but please make a fist."
Kiyoshi shakily complied. The woman pierced him with a small plastic contraption and taped it down against his skin. One of the men assisted her in setting up an IV. Another man placed a briefcase on one of the counters. Ayase strained her insect eyes to see a pair of handcuffs connecting the man's wrist and the briefcase. He unlocked the case and revealed a small metal box resting alone inside. He handed it to the woman. She fiddled with the case. "Maybe it's a combination lock," Ayase speculated aloud. The woman in the lab coat pulled a single tiny vial from the case, almost too tiny for Ayase to see. She filled a syringe with the solution.
"Stay calm,"
the woman murmured as she slowly injected it into the contraption in Kiyoshi's arm. She looked up at the monitors. For a few moments, nothing changed, and then Kiyoshi arched against the table. He gasped as the fast, high-pitched beeps of the monitors filled the room. Kiyoshi's mouth gaped open and closed like a fish struggling for air. The woman leaned her ear closer to his mouth.
"What's he saying?"
one of the men asked. She brushed it off with a hand.
"He's crying for his mama."
Ayase's lips fumbled over the words as she repeated them. She felt something sting in her human eyes, something thick clog her human throat. Someone gently rubbed her shoulders. Watching Kiyoshi strapped on that gurney with no one to comfort him made those fingers feel like fire. She shuddered and shrugged them off. The beeping of the monitors began to slow down. Kiyoshi's body went limp as he breathed slowly on the woman's command.
"In, out. Nice and slow. Good."
She nodded at the monitors, satisfied.
"He's going to be fine. Much easier than the last one."
One of the men opened a mobile phone. Another one collected the now empty cases. The woman smiled wanly at Kiyoshi as she peeled off her gloves.
Welcome to Core,
she said simply.
And welcome to a new life, Kiyoshi Honda. The teenage Deadeye.
Ayase stopped. When she recited the last part, Nick ordered her to repeat it.
Deadeye?
She heard Sachi say from somewhere.
Wait, like an archery?
The woman in the lab coat tossed her gloves into a yellow bin.
Just you wait,
she told Kiyoshi, her voice betraying her pleasure.
You're gonna be the best sniper money can't buy.
Off your ass, Oda.
Joe grunted. Half of him faded into consciousness, but the other half grasped at sleep. He felt himself siding with the latter. Something hard kicked him in the side. He choked and curled up defensively, blinking his eyes as he coughed. The hell? He wheezed. He dizzily sat up, clutching his throbbing ribs. Miki pulled the cigarette from his lips. He gave a long, wet snort before spitting a dark glob onto the stained concrete floor.
You've been stinking up the game couch with your morning crotch for days. Move.
He took a drag as he picked a game controller from the pile of them on the floor.
I need to get my FPS on.
Joe grimaced. He crawled off the couch just as Miki threw himself onto it. Joe rubbed his eyes as a loud military game started up on the TV. Joe's mouth was dry. He lit up his own cigarette, rolling his tongue along it first. His side twinged and he winced. You didn't have to kick me. Miki snorted around his cigarette.
Suck my dick. And get the hell out of here, you're done.
Joe furrowed his brow. You said I could lay low here for a while.
And you did. 3 days is the upper limit for pains in my ass.
Joe absently rubbed at his bedhead. Why? He asked, trying to mask the tendril of panic sneaking through him. I'll get off the couch. I can sleep on the floor if I'm in the way.
No.
Miki tapped at his game controller, drawing gory screams from the TV.
No one gets to live in headquarters for longer than 3 days. If I get lenient, this place will be stuffed with stone shitheads and their homeless drug dealers. It's one of Kenta's conditions.
Joe's mind raced. Kenta, the 20-something owner of the bar upstairs. Miki had talked about him earlier. Kenta was a trust fund baby going through his quarter-life crisis. Miki suspected hosting Byakko headquarters was fulfilling some punky, anti-establishment fantasy Kenta had been harboring for a long time. The few times Joe had spoken to him, Kenta had seemed nice enough. Nice and naive. If I can convince him to let me stay, does that mean I can stay? A computerized soldier died messily on the TV screen. Miki raised an eyebrow at Joe.
Why the hell won't you go home?
He muttered around his cigarette.
It's not Seiryū, is it?
Joe averted his eyes. He puffed on his cigarette, hoping Miki wouldn't insist on an answer.
I already told you, my muscle comb the streets. If there are any more Seiryū shits out there, they're too busy pissing their pants to jump you again.
Miki focused back on his TV screen.
Unless you got in some trouble you're not telling me about.
Joe dropped his cigarette to the floor and ground it out with his shoe. Nothing that bad, he lied. Just complicated. I need to wait until it blows over.
And when the hell is that?
Soon. I hope, Joe added silently. So can I talk to Kenta? Miki cursed several times under his breath.
Between this and that lot party fuckery I had to follow Bond to the other day, you're becoming a brick lodged in my swollen asshole, Joe Oda.
Joe waited.
Sometimes Kenta needs help upstairs. If you earn your keep at the bar, he might let you stay.
Joe sighed in relief. Good, he murmured.
But not a word of this to the rest of Byakko. And you sleep in one of the storage rooms, with the door closed.
Miki flicked his cigarette away.
And clean this floor, it's disgusting. And the bathrooms. We need cleaning supplies, so go out and pick some up. And while you're at it, buy me one of those donuts with the cream in the middle.
Anything else? Joe asked dryly.
Yeah, give me something with caffeine in it.
Joe brushed out his wrinkled shirt and headed out, hoping to get out of Miki's sight before the guy thought of more demands. Unfortunately, that meant Joe was leaving the hideout much more disheveled than he liked. As he climbed up the stairs to the bar, he tried to comb his hair with his fingers. Kenta hadn't arrived yet. Joe checked his watch. 8:30. It could be hours before Kenta started prep for the lunch crowd. Joe had time to spare. 8:30. Second period, Joe thought with a hint of regret. He sighed. He left the bar and let the door lock behind him. After running his fingers through his hair one last time, he headed for the nearest convenience store. Joe had never thought he'd skip so much school, but after Kiyoshi's kidnapping a few days earlier, Joe was too scared to go back to Fukuhashi. His name was on the school roster as Kiyoshi's roommate. Joe knew there was a chance, even a decent chance, that those core thugs might come for him someday, and not because they wanted to offer him a job. Joe shivered. Sachi had told him Core's plan for Kiyoshi. Things finally made sense in a weird way. Kiyoshi was a kid with few ties and a history as a champion marksman. Using a sniper was extremely noticeable. If Core wanted a sniper and recruited someone older with a military background, there might be more of a paper trail. But no one would suspect a teen who quit high school behind a trail of... Of what? Hits? There was the small chance Core wanted to snipe for his protection or to threaten enemies, but there was a much greater chance they wanted Kyoshi to kill specific targets. If Core was aligned with the Yakuza, that probably meant rival gangsters. Joe's fingers twitched. He ground his teeth. He couldn't smoke on a public street at that hour, but he desperately wanted something to distract him. When his mind lingered on Kyoshi being forced to kill people, his chest clenched so tight he could barely breathe. He turned a corner and saw the convenience store. He hurried the last few steps, feeling a small measure of relief once he was inside the air-conditioned interior. The automatic doors closed with a quiet choom behind him. There were too many unknowns with Kyoshi. Whether or not the plan with the pills would work, whether or not Nick and his church friends could get Kyoshi out of Core if the pills worked, whether or not Ayase could use her insects to... Joe shook his head to clear it. No, he thought. I'm not even going to touch that one. Joe had no idea how things were going to play out for Kyoshi and the others. He couldn't even wrap his head around the supernatural stuff. But to make matters worse, that meant Joe couldn't plan for his own future. He didn't know when, or if, it was safe for him to return to Fukahashi. He didn't know how long he could stall at Byakko headquarters. If Miki kicked him out, Joe needed to find another place to crash, and anywhere was less safe than a hidden gang hideout. And if things got particularly bad, Joe didn't know how to protect himself. All the hiding in the world didn't change the fact that if some juiced-up Core operative grabbed him, Joe was fucked. Joe barely stood a chance in fair fights. Joe let out a breath and headed for the drink aisle. He found himself longing for his second period class, and the simple, safe structure of a half-assed curriculum. School wasn't so bad, and with the way things were going, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to attend any school again. Kyoshi probably won't. Joe's chest tightened again. He gritted his teeth as he grabbed a canned coffee. Joe picked up Miki's requests and a few necessities for himself. Once he stepped through the automatic doors again, he realized how hungry he was. There was a bakery next door, which sounded more appealing than convenience store food. He headed over, made an order at the counter, then fell into a wire chair at one of the few small dining tables. He let out a breath and rubbed a hand over his face. He needed to stay calm. His steady nerves had gotten him through most of the hairy situations in his life. Nothing even came close to the trouble he was in now, but his philosophy hadn't changed. He needed to look at things logically. He needed to adapt as necessary and assess risks as they came up. He could get through this. He could get through this.
Life throwing you a curveball, Joe Oda?
Joe's heart froze in his chest as he looked up from the table. Toya Kamishita stood on the other side. With a thin, unreadable smile, the upperclassman sat down in the chair opposite Joe. For a few seconds, Joe could only try to calm his racing heart. He swallowed and looked away, cursing how jumpy he'd gotten.
I'm sorry.
Toya tilted his head slightly.
Did I scare you?
Joe licked his teeth. A little, he murmured. Not a Core operative out to kill you. Keep it together, Joe.
You should be a little scared,
he said, folding his gloved hands on the table. He smiled like a lizard.
I just caught you skipping.
Joe cleared his throat. Family emergency, he lied. And not to be cheeky, but you're not in school right now either.
I'm a busy man, Joe-kun, but I can assure you, all my absences are excused. I'm on an errand for a teacher.
He raised an eyebrow.
From what the administrators tell me, you've missed school for several days, and so have a few of your classmates. Somehow I doubt you're all having family emergencies at the same time.
Joe shrugged. I can only speak for myself. Toya said nothing. The waitress came with Joe's food a moment later. She asked Toya if he wanted to order, but he politely declined. Once she was gone, Joe looked down at the stuffed roll on his plate. He knew he had to eat something, but he lost his appetite.
I know you're in trouble, Joe-kun.
Joe swallowed. I'm not, he argued, although the words sounded weak in his ears.
I've worked with at-risk teens long enough to know the signs.
Toya leaned back in his chair.
Every time I bump into you, you look more afraid than the time before. And no matter how many times I offer you my help, you refuse to tell me anything.
A slight defensive streak kicked in for Joe. He looked up from the table and met Toya's eyes. Senpai, he said as evenly as possible, you make a lot of assumptions about me. And not to be rude, but I really don't know you. I'm not sure why you keep pushing me to talk to you. Toya flipped a gloved finger in the air.
I'm a student advisor. It's my job to pursue troubled classmates.
And they all take you up on your offer? Something very, very cold pulled at the smile on Toya's face.
Enough do. But I don't only advise students, and the people I advise tell me what I need to know to stay on top of this city's problems.
A chill ran down Joe's spine. What's that supposed to mean? He blurted.
I know there's been some unusually dangerous developments on the street lately. Developments that could pull in unsuspecting teenagers.
Joe's heart started to pound. That familiar tension, that uncertainty Joe got around Toya started bubbling up in Joe's stomach. As usual, it felt like Toya was pulling a rug out from under Joe, and Toya's words felt even more loaded than usual. Joe swallowed hard. Did Toya know Kiyoshi went missing? If he knew about the streets, did he know about Nick? Everyone knew Joe and Kiyoshi had been at Blue Light the night of the drug bust, and the Gaijin Time Bomb's presence there wasn't exactly secret. The fact that there was a bounty on his head was common enough knowledge. Even Miki had known about it. But the source of that bounty was a fiercely kept secret. The smile was gone from Toya's face, the look in his eyes suddenly serious. Joe wondered for a dizzying moment if Toya was as well informed as he implied. What exactly do you know? Joe asked as carefully as he could. Toya leaned in.
Joe-kun, I know that there may be no truly safe place for you right now.
Joe's stomach dropped. He felt a cold sweat starting up on his temples. What exactly do you know? He repeated.
That I can protect you from these people.
The smile returned to Toya's face, but there was something much darker behind it this time.
Your little friends at the church aren't the only ones trying to take them down.
Joe's mouth went dry. Before he could respond, Toya went on.
This isn't an offer for your friends, Joe-kun. This is an offer for you. And I expect you to keep it private.
He unfolded his hands.
In a week or two, I'll send you a gift to show you how serious I am. If it convinces you to join me, give me a call.
His smile took a slant.
I take it you still have my number?
Joe stared at Toya dumbly. He managed a nod.
Good. This is my final offer, Joe-kun. If I don't hear from you, I'll assume you passed.
Toya pushed back his chair and slowly rose to his feet.
Although I trust you'll be smart enough to make that call. I know you're being faced with a lot of choices right now. And be sure to make the right one.
Joe's blood went cold. He dropped his eyes to the table. But why me? Why only me?
You and I have a lot more in common than you think. And good people should stick together.
Toya drummed his gloved fingers once on the table.
Take me up on my offer, and I'll show you a side of yourself you never knew.
And with that, he left. Joe stared at his plate while Toya's footsteps faded. The door opened with a check. There was a whoosh of air, and then the door shut, its bell tinkling softly. For several minutes, Joe sat in silence. He tried to process Toya's words, combing over them for more information. Toya had mentioned the church. He already knew much more than Joe had even speculated.
Sir?
Joe looked up. The waitress glanced meaningfully at Joe's untouched bread before raising her eyebrows at him.
Is everything all right here?
Joe swallowed again hard. No, he thought miserably. Nothing's all right. Joe rubbed his temples. May I just have the check? He asked, trying and failing to sound casual. The waitress nodded. As he listened to her leave, he decided to stop by the convenience store one more time. He needed antacids. Lots of them.
Kiyoshi was on his 9th day of captivity. Ayase, on a short break from her constant surveillance, slumped in her chair. They're bringing him back to the basement of the parking garage, she sighed. I think it's target practice again. That gun guy is with him. Sachi nodded as he scribbled into a notepad.
Should I get Nick?
No. I'll let you know if anything changes. She let her eyes fall on the tape recorder, her companion 24 hours a day. She bit her lip. She wanted to turn it off. She knew that wasn't fair. It was an invaluable tool filling in gaps when a human hand couldn't write fast enough, staying by her side in case things happened when she was alone. But a part of her, a very fundamental part, was horrified that she was being recorded almost every moment of every day. The sounds of her breathing, the words that spilled out of her when she put herself in her bug's eyes. Her reactions in this incredibly difficult time were being immortalized. When she thought too hard about that, her stomach twisted into knots. She knew it was a necessary evil. It was just wearing on her. A few weeks ago, she'd led her life in comfortable solitude. Now she was the center of attention and the only lifeline to a classmate who could be killed at any moment. 9 days. Ayase rubbed her eyes. This is really starting to get to me.
Ayase?
Sachi asked gently. It was the 100 millionth time she'd heard him say her name in that voice.
Are you okay?
Of course she wasn't, and he knew that. At least he'd stopped touching her while asking, and all things considered, Sachi's support since they'd unofficially moved into the church was far more helpful than otherwise. But hearing him slip into his default empty comforting mode was a bad sign. It meant he was running out of real comfort to offer her, which meant he was probably running out of juice too. Ayase stood. She stretched her arms out and felt the popping of stiff muscles along her neck and shoulders. "You can take a break," she offered as she rolled her shoulders. "It takes them 10 minutes to get through all the security checkpoints." Sachi shrugged.
I'm fine, unless you're hungry.
"Not really." Sachi pushed up the glasses that slid down his nose.
Then I'm fine. I'll use the time to clean up my notes.
Ayase frowned. She considered taking a quick walk, but seeing Sachi flip through his notebook with his brow furrowed made her feel guilty. He wasn't working as hard as she was since he could switch out with the others, but he'd volunteered to take almost every single shift. And the past few nights she'd even let him sleep on a futon by her bed. He was trying to work as hard as she was. Ayase tentatively sat back down. He looked so serious as he went through his notes. Maybe it was just the glasses.
Don't let me keep you here.
Sachi offered without looking up.
Take a walk if you want.
Ayase squirmed in her chair. "I'll wait until they start target practice," she offered. "Then I can take a real break." He didn't respond as he flipped through the pages. He eventually settled on one. He marked it with quick strokes. Ayase closed her eyes. Kiyoshi was in the basement of the core building being subjected to his usual pat-down. The man who performed the search made a comment and slapped Kiyoshi on the back, jarring him forward a step. Kiyoshi blurted something Ayase couldn't quite make out.
"It's really taken to you. One of the perks of using pitch in your teen years, I guess."
The man smirked at Kiyoshi.
"I would have killed to have your arms in high school. I was pitcher for my baseball team."
Kiyoshi murmured a non-committal answer. From one of her positions under Kiyoshi's collar, she could feel him shudder.
"How's the personal training been? Do you like our gym?"
Kiyoshi shrugged.
"Pitch doesn't work on its own, you know. You need to train with it in your system, like steroids. But with the right conditioning..."
The man shook his head.
"You're an athlete, Honda. You can't tell me you're not enjoying how cut you're getting."
It was Ayase's turn to shudder.
"Yeah, I guess,"
Kiyoshi said as the man hovered over him.
Sir?
Ayase?
Ayase opened her eyes. Sachi poked at something in his notebook.
You said the gun guy is bringing Kiyoshi to sniper practice, right?
He tapped the notebook with his pen.
Do we have a name for this guy yet?
Ayase shook her head. He makes Kiyoshi call him senpai, she explained. And no one else uses his name. I've heard some of the guards talking about him, but they just call him the gun otaku. Sachi frowned.
Well, that's not very helpful. But maybe it's on purpose. Maybe they don't tell the guards his name.
It was an early theory of Nick's, and it seemed more likely by the day. Less than 12 hours after Kiyoshi's first injection, he'd started training with his new senpai. The man, in his mid to late 20s, fit the profile of an otaku. He was clearly obsessed with guns and rambled so excitedly about sniper rifles that Kiyoshi didn't understand a thing until the man dumbed down his training multiple times. He'd been training Kiyoshi on a particular model of rifle, and his glee during the sessions Kiyoshi learned to assemble and operate the gun paled in comparison to his glee during their fake field training in the parking garage. The otaku giggled whenever Kiyoshi hit a target. It was extremely disturbing. Ayase closed her eyes again. The otaku was there as always, impatiently dancing from one foot to the next as security cleared Kiyoshi. Once they were done, he grabbed Kiyoshi by the arm and cackled as he dragged Kiyoshi to practice. She opened her eyes. Nothing new, she reported. Nick's trying to figure out his identity with what we have, but I don't think he's having much luck. I can't give him a lot of details. Sachi flipped to another page.
The otaku has a twitch,
he recited.
He said it was from using too much meth. He was supposed to be core sniper, but he lost a chance when he couldn't get clean.
Yeah. There was a knock at the door. Ayase turned as Nick stuck his head into the room.
Do you have 10 minutes?
Sachi raised his eyebrows at Ayase. She switched back to the core building for a few seconds. Yeah, she said at last. They just started target practice. Satisfied, Nick opened the door. He had a mobile phone against his ear, and after he marched over to Ayase's table, he snatched up her tape recorder. Emmy shuffled in behind him, a plate of sandwiches in her hands. Nick grunted into the mobile.
I want you on speakerphone, but I'll turn off the recorder, deal?
Ayase furrowed her eyebrows. As Emmy cleared room on the table for the food, Ayase leaned toward her. Who's Nick talking to? Ayase asked. Emmy looked up quickly. The plate tilted in her hand and one of the sandwiches plopped onto the floor. She cried out and leveled the plate as she caught another sandwich on its way down. Sachi picked up the sandwich on the wood. Emmy sighed in frustration and slid the plate on the table.
What was that?
She asked tiredly. Ayase could practically feel the anxiety rolling off the woman. Sachi had mentioned that to Ayase at some point. Emi was radiating worry and panic every time Sachi bumped into her, but neither Sachi nor Ayase had shared more than a few sentences with the woman, and with everything else they had to worry about, the new additions to the church were the furthest things from their minds. Ayase pointed to Nick. Emi followed Ayase's finger as Nick barked into the phone.
Oh.
Emi brushed a strand of hair out of her face.
The detective? Nakajima. She's been helping the church for a while. Nick-san mentioned that, didn't he?
Emi crossed her arms and rubbed them absently.
She said she has news for us. And Nick-san insists we keep you kids in the loop from now on.
Ayase felt her dislike for Nick lessen very slightly. If he's going to exploit my power, she thought, that's the least he can offer me. Nick finally finished his negotiation and snapped the recorder off. He pushed a button on his phone and rested it on the table.
Can you hear me?
He said in the phone's general direction. There was a pause. Then, from the phone, in very polite Japanese.
Loud and clear, soldier-san.
That was Nakajima, all right. Ayase flashed back to the day she'd met Nakajima in the police station. It felt like a lifetime ago.
Good.
Nick looked around the room.
Everyone who's here, let her know that you're listening. Emi first.
Emi licked her lips.
Here?
She said awkwardly, like they were in roll call. Sachi straightened.
Sachi Ishida. It's been a long time, Detective.
Ishida-kun, I trust you've been very helpful.
I hope so.
Ayase sighed. Ayase Watanabe, she said. Hello. There was another pause on the phone.
Good work. Very good work, Watanabe-kun.
Ayase felt a small flame of confidence flicker in her heart. Sachi smiled at her. The flame grew a bit brighter. Daniel suddenly flew into the room.
Sorry, we were talking to the medical supply company. Have you started?
Nick scowled.
Get your ass over here. And where's Zayed?
As if to answer the question, Zayed stepped in behind Daniel. Without a word, he shut the door behind him. It was everyone. Everyone Ayase knew of, anyway. With the number of phone calls she heard being made every day, there were potentially hundreds of people in on the plan with Kiyoshi, but the 5 people who crowded with her around the table were the ones she had met at least.
Good.
Nick snatched Sachi's notebook and flipped to an open page.
Lay it on us, Nakajima.
Nakajima let out a breath.
I've narrowed down the list of buildings that could potentially be housing Honda-kun. Watanabe-kun's directions were a little vague, but I lined them up with office buildings that matched the security profile. I'll need more time to make a definitive match.
Nick uncapped a pen with his teeth.
We don't have a lot of time,
he murmured as he scribbled something down.
Kiyoshi's already had 3 doses of pitch and we only gave him 4 blockers. And I'm not convinced his last antagonist will work if it's been slowly breaking down in his mouth for over a week.
By that logic, do you think any blocker after the first really worked?
Ayase swallowed. Nick spit out the pen cap.
My point is, we need him out. Move fast on the building ID.
Nick glared meaningfully at the phone.
Do you have anything real for us?
Ayase heard a slight scoff from the other end of the phone.
Watch your tone, or I may be forced to remind you of your position.
Daniel sighed.
I'm sorry. We're all very tired, Detective.
I understand that. So I took the liberty of checking some of the records of Fukuhashi.
There was the slight rustling of papers.
It seems someone signed Honda-kun out of school a few days ago.
They went back to Fukuhashi?
A chill ran down Ayase's spine.
It's unsurprising that Core would try to cover Honda-kun's disappearance. That sort of thoroughness is typical of them. And it would be easy to fool a school administrator with a fake family ID. But what interests me is who they listed as signing him out. You said his guardian is an uncle who lives in Kyoto, correct?
Yeah, why?
Because that's not the name I see here.
Nakajima let out a breath.
Does Honda-kun have an adult sister?
Ayase froze. She met Sachi's widened eyes. The long-lost sister, the one Joe had suggested at the very beginning, could be connected to Kiyoshi's seemingly random kidnapping. Ayase's mind raced as she put the pieces together.
Could his sister be a member of Core? Is that why they targeted him?
Nick scowled.
What sister?
He hasn't seen her in years. She wasn't around when his parents died. That's why his uncle got custody. They didn't even know where she lived.
Daniel gripped his chin.
If she didn't have a known address, maybe they just created an identity for her so the school couldn't check up on it. If they sent someone pretending to be his uncle after all, Fukuhashi would have his contact information on record.
Maybe.
Zayed slowly shook his head.
But if his sister is truly in Core, it would give them legal ways to keep him in custody. Maybe that is why they targeted him. We have to consider it.
Wait.
The room went quiet. All eyes flew to Emmy, who still clutched her elbows. She swallowed hard. Ayase could see the bear shake to her hands.
Emmy, do you know something about this?
Emmy shook her head.
If a woman signed him out of school, it wasn't his sister.
She closed her eyes.
Because I'm his sister.
The silence that followed was deafening. There was the faint rustling of papers over the phone.
Emmy Honda.
Nakajima said evenly, her voice echoing in the quiet.
That's the name on the school form.
Nick snapped out of his surprise to jerk his head to Emmy.
Emmy Honda? Is your last name Honda?
Daniel murmured a prayer.
It's a common name. I didn't make the connection.
Nick stomped over to the slight woman and grabbed her shoulders.
Emmy! Why the fuck didn't you say anything?
Emmy hiccuped. Nick shook her hard. Everyone in the room ran at him at once.
Nick!
Daniel cried as he pulled Emmy free. Zayed and Sachi each grabbed one of Nick's arms, but he easily shook them off. The American snarled.
We've been chasing that kid for 9 days. When the hell were you planning on telling us?
Emmy shook her head in a panic.
I didn't think it was relevant. I didn't want to compromise the mission.
Ayase by the priest's side unclenched her tense muscles. She'd been half ready to become the swarm. Seeing Nick explode still brought out her defense mechanisms. Now closer to Emmy, Ayase studied the woman. Ayase had recognized Emmy from her time in the jar, so Emmy had seemed familiar the first day they'd properly met. But now that Ayase examined the shape of Emmy's eyes and the slope of her jaw, there was something else familiar about her, something less tangible. She looks like Kiyoshi. Ayase's stomach sank. She suddenly felt very stupid. 9 days of surveillance and she'd barely spoken to Emmy. And the few times they'd shared words, Emmy had asked for gloomy little details on Kiyoshi, like whether Kor was giving him enough to eat. Emmy had shuffled around that church in a panicked daze. Ayase looked at the floor. She felt infinitely more depressed.
Does Kor know you're with us? Did they take him to get to us? Did they use your name instead of the uncle to send us that message that... Shit!
Emmy buried her face in her hands.
I don't know! I only found out my parents died when I came back to Japan 3 months ago. I wanted to get back in touch with Kiyoshi, but I was so ashamed. I didn't know how to face him when I failed him so horribly.
Daniel rubbed Emmy's shaking back.
You were waiting for the right time,
he offered. Nick laughed without humor and dropped into a chair.
You sure as hell missed the right time. If you had him in some unsupervised kid living in a dorm, I doubt they would have had the balls to snap him up like that. Nice work, Emmy.
Emmy started to cry. As Daniel pulled the woman against his shoulder, Zayed narrowed his eyes at Nick.
You are not helping.
Nick responded with a rude gesture. Nakajima sighed over the phone.
You can sort out your issues on your own time. This is my day off.
Do you have anything else for us?
Yes, I made some phone calls to Hokkaido after Emi-san couldn't breach the mountains. A pair of rangers made it to your communications outpost after the storm cleared out.
Daniel looked up abruptly.
And?
Your little hacker and her bodyguard are gone. Their clothes were still in their drawers, and there were signs of a struggle.
Daniel went pale. Nick slammed the table again.
Damn it!
Please stop doing that.
Nick crossed his arms.
Was it the feds? Shorty said it was only a matter of time before someone realized she was using the satellite.
Possibly. I don't have easy access to federal arrest records.
Zayed shook his head.
We waited too long. We should have pulled them out after the Milan operation was finished. The satellite wasn't strictly needed for anything else.
Ayase was getting lost. She exchanged glances with Sachi. He looked just as confused. Ayase was starting to wonder how far the connections of this little church reached. Nick seemed to notice the two of them.
No more details on that. The kids are still here. But you can get access to federal arrest records if you try, right?
Yes, give me a few days.
Prioritize finding the building with Kiyoshi. But once you've got that, look for Shorty and Adam.
Alright. My mobile phone is dying, so I need to hang up. Is there anything else you need from me, Soldier-san?
Stop calling me that!
I'm not good with foreign names.
Ayase slowly lowered herself into her chair. While Nick and Daniel went over a few more details with Nakajima, Ayase closed her eyes. She wanted to check on Kiyoshi. It was hard to concentrate. Ayase squeezed her eyes shut tighter and focused on shifting her perception. From her bug perched on a pillar, she could see that target practice wasn't yet over. Kiyoshi was lying on his stomach, his arms wrapped around the long gun that rested on a low tripod. His face was pushed up to the scope. Ayase couldn't see the target on the far end of the garage, but she recognized the squeal of the otaku by Kiyoshi's side.
Attaboy, Honda! Your accuracy is unreal! How many years did you do archery? I can totally believe you fucked that shit up.
Kiyoshi didn't respond. He pulled back from the gun to reload. Ayase's antennae picked up some quiet ringing. The otaku flipped open a mobile phone and pushed it against his ear.
Yeah?
The otaku listened for a moment. Then a wide, crazy smile twisted his face. He nudged Kiyoshi with his boot. Kiyoshi stopped what he was doing and looked up.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
The otaku twitched, then excitedly gestured to the few guards with him.
I'll send someone to get the live rounds immediately. I can have them packed up and ready to go at 1600.
1600, Ayase repeated in her head. 4 in the afternoon. Ayase locked her attention on the otaku. He turned off his phone and jumped into the air, pumping his fist as he crowed.
Time to pop your cherry, Honda!
The otaku excitedly righted Kiyoshi's huge gun and started disassembling it.
You just got your first real target!
Kiyoshi's eyes widened. Ayase snapped open. The room was still fully occupied. Daniel and Nick were arguing while Emmy sat sullenly in a corner. Sachi was explaining something in his notebook to Zayed, his fingers running along a page. "Everyone," Ayase blurted. Only Sachi seemed to notice her. He looked up, alert.
Ayase?
"Core's moving," Ayase said, louder. "They're taking Kiyoshi on his first mission at 4 p.m. That caught everyone's attention. All eyes turned to her abruptly.
What?
Ayase looked up at the clock on the wall. 3:45. She swallowed. "We have 15 minutes before those people make Kiyoshi a murderer."
Joe took a breath and heaved. He shoved yet another cardboard box onto the tall pile on his dolly. The empty liquor bottles clinked inside. Joe panted and wiped his face with a forearm. Sweat dampened his rolled-up sleeves. "Are there any more, Kenta-san?" Kenta looked over his shoulder as he slid a glass to a bar customer.
"Did you get the ones in the basement?"
"I got those first." Joe grimaced at the memory. The hideout was packed with Byakko members slumming around after school, and they found it hilarious that Joe was working for Kenta instead of going to class. Something about how skipping didn't count if you were doing it to work.
"Then that's everything. You can wheel them out to the alley. Are you putting them in the recycling dumpster or just lining them up beside it?"
"No, I'm putting them in."
"Good."
Kenta wiped his hands on his apron.
"The city keeps complaining about that. And no matter how many times I tell those boys downstairs, they always just dump the boxes on the ground. They're so lazy."
Joe kicked up the dolly. "I try to be a good citizen."
"Then I think you picked the wrong group of friends."
Joe chose not to respond as he wheeled the dolly around Kenta and through the side door of the bar. He turned and slowly eased the dolly down the few steps. Sighing, he threw the door shut before pushing his boxes down the alley. "I can smell myself," Joe thought with extreme distaste. "And it's the unholy scent of sweat and booze." Considering he was practically homeless, Joe was keeping decently clean. The public bath and a nearby laundromat were there when he felt especially scummy. But helping out Kenta was taking up more and more hours of Joe's day. And the work was manual labor. Mopping floors, collecting trash, cleaning alcohol-scented puke from the bathroom in the mornings. Sometimes Joe didn't have time to do more than wash up in the bathroom. And that griminess bugged him on a fundamental level. Joe stopped his dolly by the recycling dumpster. He grabbed a box of bottles, jumped up on the high curb, and emptied them to clink and clatter in the giant bin. He sighed. 9 days. He'd been hiding out for 9 days, and the church still hadn't retrieved Kiyoshi. Joe made his daily phone call to Sachi to check in, but with each passing day, Sachi's optimism grew faker. They didn't have good news yet. They didn't have news yet, period. Joe could feel himself falling into a false sense of security. Things had been so quiet for so long that a part of him believed the danger had passed. That was bullshit, of course, since the rescue mission wasn't complete, and the attempt to break out Kiyoshi would surely be the most dangerous time of all. But there was something about the ritual of his day. Waking up, listening to Miki complain at him, helping Kenta with the bar, trying to sleep as Byakko members screamed at each other in the game room. It felt so mundane. Peaceful. And that was dangerous. Joe emptied his final box of bottles. As he folded up the cardboard and tied it to his pile of flattened boxes, he wondered, absently, if Kiyoshi was feeling the same complacency in his daily core training.
"I wanted to say goodbye."
Joe angrily shook his head. No, he told himself for the millionth time. It wasn't goodbye. Joe needed a smoke. His hands were disgusting, so he grabbed the outdoor hose for a quick spray over his palms. He dragged his hands on his pants to dry them before digging his cigarettes out of his pocket. He'd just taken his first drag when he noticed something at the end of the alley. There was someone in a school uniform wandering back and forth on the sidewalk. His shoulders were hunched and his head darted this way and that, like he was looking for something. It was weirdly conspicuous. Joe took another drag and squinted. A new Byakko recruit, he wondered? Someone who forgot which bar the HQ was hiding under? The uniform looked like Fukuhashi's. Joe couldn't make out the face. After another minute, it was clear the student wasn't looking for the bar. He was examining the cars parked along the street. He kept ducking near license plates, peering in windows. He looked like the world's worst criminal planning his break-ins. Joe tightened his jaw. That false sense of security retreated as suspicion took its place. Joe wandered closer to the street, trying to look as casual as possible. Once he was close enough, Joe recognized the guy. It was the disturbed kid from his class. What was his name? Kato something? As usual, he looked like complete hell. And he was muttering to himself. Kato kept glancing into his fist, loosening the white-knuckled grip with his palm upward, like he clutched something inside there. He was acting suspicious, but Joe had no clue what kind of suspicious. Joe frowned. An idea flitted across his mind. "Hey," he called out as a test. Kato?" Kato's head snapped up. He threw his hands behind his back, hiding whatever he was holding.
Oda-san.
He knows my name. Joe tried to count the number of words he'd shared with that guy. A dozen? A dozen and a fist, considering their run-in on that fateful night at Blue Light. Joe took another drag. Maybe he'd left an impression on Kato. Or maybe Kato rightfully regretted taking a swing at Joe. It didn't matter. "Are you looking for something?" Joe asked carefully. Kato averted his eyes. He shook his head, completely unconvincingly. "This isn't a neighborhood you should poke around in, considering..." Joe trailed off, not wanting to imply anything about the Byakko hideout. "You kinda stand out." Kato swallowed and didn't reply. He looked pale under his uniform, especially in contrast with the dark school jacket. Joe saw the sheen of sweat on Kato's forehead. He was disturbed. Maybe Sachi had been right. Maybe Kato suffered from some sort of mental problem. But there was more to it than that. Joe had seen that look on drug addicts who knew they couldn't pay off their dealers. Something had scared Kato. Shitless. But Joe still needed information. He dropped the cigarette and ground it into the alley floor. He took a few careful steps forward. Almost in sync, Kato stepped back.
I'm busy. Whatever you need, I can't help you.
Joe prickled a little. "I didn't say I needed anything," he retorted. "Easy, man. I just wanted to ask you a question." Kato shook his head. "Can I ask it first? Shit." Joe scowled. "Did I fuck you over in another life? Why the hell are you so defensive?" Kato squirmed uncomfortably, like a kid who needed to pee.
No, I just...
He swallowed and clenched his teeth, his jaw tightening weakly. Joe waited. But Kato said nothing more, his hands remaining firmly behind his back. Joe furrowed his brow. "I just wanted to know if anyone was asking around about me," he muttered. "At school. I haven't been there much lately." Kato's dark eyes finally rose from the concrete.
Asking about you?
"Yeah. Anyone suspicious, or just anyone who seemed more interested than they should be." Kato opened his mouth. He looked like he was about to say something, but then he went impossibly paler. He closed his mouth and looked away. Fuck. Joe's patience was wearing thin, and it looked like Kato did know something. Joe clenched his fists and took another step forward. Screeching tires suddenly erupted from around the corner. Joe instinctively shrunk back as a dark blue car swerved onto their street. It screeched to a halt a few storefronts away from Kiseki. At almost the same moment, at least a dozen figures with baseball bats and ski masks swarmed around the same corner. Adrenaline pumped through Joe's body as his mind raced. He unconsciously grabbed Kato and dragged him to hide a few steps into the alley. Kato freaked out at the touch. He tried to pull out of Joe's grip, pleading with him to let go. "Shut up!" Joe hissed as he watched the mob overrun the sidewalk. A young woman walking her dog screamed and ran into the street, but they ignored her. The masked thugs, including several more who stepped out of the dark car, were running toward one destination. Joe's blood ran cold. The first man reached Kiseki. He kicked the door in.
"We're here for Byakko! Bring him out or we torch the place!"
No. No. Kato pried at Joe's iron fingers. He squirmed wildly as he stared down the street.
Navy blue. Toyota 4369.
Joe felt the world closing in. The last shred of his peaceful life shattered when he heard Kenta scream.